The most powerful man in the world kept a notebook he never intended anyone to read, and the fact that it reached you at all is an accident that came very close to not happening. Marcus Aurelius ran the Roman Empire for 19 years, which in his lifetime meant everything from the wall in the north of Britain to the edge of the desert in Africa and east until the roads gave out. He could have had anything written down by anyone in any language for whatever audience he chose. What he did instead was sit up at night in a military tent at the far edge of his own territory, writing in Greek to nobody, saying the same handful of things to himself over and over, the way a person repeats a name they are afraid of forgetting. He was not a philosopher by trade. He was the working government of the known world at a moment when the world was coming apart in his hands. A sickness moving through the provinces that may have killed as many as 1 person in 10, an enemy army standing inside Italy for the first time in 270 years, and a treasury so empty that he had the contents of the palace carried out into a public square and sold at auction, the gold plate and his wife's jewels, for 2 months rather than tax people who were already burying their families. That was the daytime. The writing happened after, and what he wrote has no argument in it, and no system, and no sign anywhere that he thought of it as a book. It is a man telling himself the same few things and then telling himself them again, and then a year later, in a different camp, on a different river, telling himself them again. There is nothing else quite like it. Powerful men have left memoirs by the shelf-load, all of them composed to be read. What almost nobody has ever left behind is the private argument, the part where you are trying to talk yourself into behaving decently tomorrow, and it is not going particularly well. The questions he keeps circling are not clever ones. How you stay a good man when nothing whatsoever is forcing you to be one. What you do with a day you did not choose and cannot hand back. And underneath both, sitting there unanswered across 12 books, whether the whole arrangement is going anywhere at all or is only particles knocking about in the dark, and whether that ought to change anything about how you behave in the morning. So there are 2 possibilities, and neither of them is comfortable. Either the things he kept telling himself did not work, or repeating them is exactly what working looks like. He was also certain, and said so plainly more than once, that being remembered after your death is worth nothing whatsoever. Somebody kept the notebook anyway. It falls almost entirely out of the record for the better part of 1,000 years, surfaces in the hands of a bishop who had worn his own copy out from use and had a fresh one made, and reaches print in the 1500s from a manuscript that vanished within a few years and has never been found since. So the whole of what that mind ever worked out, all of it, including the one place near the end where it gives way, came down to us through a run of accidents he would have called meaningless. I have never worked out whether that is funny or sad. One more thing about him, and it is the reason this particular mind belongs at this hour rather than any other. He slept badly. He was in pain for most of his adult life, the chest, the stomach, something he described in a letter as an ulcer working away at his windpipe. And his physician made him a daily compound with 70 ingredients ground into it, and one of the 70 was poppy. At some point, it was leaving him too drowsy for the work, so they took the poppy out. Then he could not sleep at all, so they put it back in. The steadiness that ends up printed on posters belonged, a great deal of the time, to a man lying awake in the dark, medicated, talking himself down. So you are in reasonable company tonight. Whatever has you up, he had a version of it, and he had it with a war going on outside the tent. None of this is a test. There is nothing here you need to keep hold of, and nowhere you have to be for the next several hours. Let your jaw come unclenched. It usually is clenched at this hour, and almost nobody notices. We have a long way to go, and no reason at all to hurry, and if you go under somewhere in the middle of it, that is not a lapse of attention. That is more or less what the writing was for. If work like this seems worth making, subscribing is the thing that keeps it possible. And here is one question to carry down with you, or to leave in the comments if you would rather. What is the sentence you have had to tell yourself more than once, the one that never quite stays told? He was 3 years old when his father died. Almost nothing of him survived except a reputation for modesty and a steadiness people still mentioned years afterward, and a small boy who would spend the next 55 years trying to become someone he could not actually remember. In the last week of February, in the year 138, someone came up to a house on one of the hills of Rome to tell a 16-year-old that he needed to pack. The arrangement he was being packed into had been assembled in a hurry by a dying man out of the wreckage of a previous arrangement. Hadrian had been emperor for 20 years and was now very ill, in a kind of pain that made him ask more than one person to help him end it, and he had spent his last strength on the question of who came after him. 2 years earlier, he had settled it by adopting a nobleman of great charm and poor health, who then obliged everybody by dying on the 1st of January. That left about 8 weeks to rebuild the future of the world. Hadrian's solution was to adopt a 51-year-old senator named Antoninus, steady, rich, childless, universally liked, the safest pair of hands in Italy, on one condition. Antoninus had to adopt 2 boys of his own on the same day, the 7-year-old son of the heir who had just died, and Marcus. So the boy on the hill was not being made emperor. He was being made the emperor after the next one, a name placed in the 3rd position of a chain by a man in agony who wanted the succession settled before the pain finished the argument for him. Nobody consulted him. Nobody was going to. He was told to leave his mother's house and move into the imperial residence, which is a shorter distance than it sounds and a considerable distance in every way that mattered. He took it badly. The story that came down is that the household found him gloomy rather than delighted, and that when somebody finally asked him what on earth there was to be miserable about, he answered by listing at some length the specific evils that having absolute power tends to do to a person. There is another piece to it, stranger and better, that around the same time he dreamt his shoulders had turned to ivory, and in the dream he tested them against a weight and found they carried it better than the shoulders he had before. Both of those come to us through a Roman biography written 2 centuries afterward by an author who forged documents when the mood took him, so hold them loosely. But the shape of the thing, that the offer of the world landed on him like a diagnosis, surfaces early and from more than one direction, and I suspect something in it is true. Most people have had a smaller version of the same afternoon, the role that arrives when somebody dies. The responsibility everybody has quietly agreed is now yours. The thing you would have been glad to be asked about, if anyone had thought to ask. Here is who he was before any of that. His mother, Domitia Lucilla, was one of the richest women in Rome, and the money came from an unglamorous and rather wonderful source, a brickworks on the edge of the city. Roman bricks were stamped at the kiln with the name of whoever owned the works, and hers turn up pressed into the fabric of the city, load-bearing and anonymous, holding up buildings that people walked past without a thought. He wrote later that what he took from her was plain food, a habit of not dwelling on ugly thoughts, and a way of living that stayed as far as possible from how the wealthy actually lived, which is a slightly awkward thing to inherit from a brick fortune, and he seems to have known it. His father had died when he was very small, so the household that raised him was really his grandfather's, a man who had been consul 3 separate times and prefect of the city, and who was close enough to Hadrian that the emperor's attention fell on the family early and stayed there. It fell on the boy in particular. Hadrian gave him a nickname, which is the sort of thing emperors do carelessly and everybody else remembers forever. The family name was Verus, meaning true. Hadrian called him Verissimus, Verissimus, the superlative, truest, most honest of them all. It was a joke about a solemn child, and it was also, in a way that must have been faintly unnerving to grow up under, an instruction. He was enrolled among the Knights of Rome at 6. At 8, he was made a member of an ancient college of priests who danced through the streets in archaic armor at certain times of year, singing a hymn so old that by then nobody could fully understand it, the priests included. Picture the small boy learning the syllables by rote, a child performing a rite whose meaning had drained out of it centuries before he was born, and doing it correctly, because that was what was in front of him to do. At 11, he found philosophy, and reacted to it the way an 11-year-old reacts to anything. The man who taught him painting also taught him something about the Greek way of living, and Marcus took it up whole. The coarse cloak, the rough discipline, and a decision to stop sleeping in a bed and lie on the bare floor instead. There were people in that house sleeping on hard surfaces who had not decided to. That is the objection, and it is not a small one, and I do not think it can be waved off. A wealthy boy who takes off his good clothes, puts on a rough cloak, and lies down on the ground is not undergoing hardship. He is wearing a costume, and the whole difference between the costume and the condition is that he can stand up whenever he wants to. His mother eventually talked him into a bed with skins on it, which tells you the floor was negotiable the entire time, and that the person it cost the most was probably her. Every fashion of voluntary poverty ever adopted by the comfortable has this shape. The discomfort is real as a sensation and completely unreal as a life, because the exit is never locked, and the people in the same building with no exit are generally not consulted about how ennobling it all is, and yet the habit outlasted the pose by a very long way. The last decade of his life was spent in field camps on a northern river in conditions no one had offered him any choice about, and the people who watched him do it did not report a man in difficulty with it. Whether the boy on the floor had anything to do with that, I genuinely cannot tell you. I have gone back and forth on it for years. There is a version where the 11-year-old was posturing and got lucky, and a version where he was quietly building something he would need 40 years later, and the honest answer is that nobody can see far enough into a child to know which. Stand in it for a moment, though. You are 16. You have met the Emperor a handful of times, and he has always been generous with you in a way that felt like being weighed. Someone has just informed you that a man you barely know is now legally your father, that you have been fitted into a plan drawn up by a dying man who was in too much pain to explain it, and that the plan ends with you holding everything. There is no version of that afternoon in which you say no. Nothing is being offered. You are being told. And then nothing happened for a very long time. Antoninus turned out to be one of the healthiest men in the empire. He reigned for 23 years, and they were, by the standards of Roman history, almost eerily uneventful. No great wars, no purges, no crisis worth the name. Marcus was made consul at 18 and given serious powers in his 20s, and for the most part what he did with the next 2 decades was stand slightly behind an older man and wait. Even the marriage was rearranged around him. The girl he had been promised to at 15 was quietly unpromised, and a different match was arranged with the daughter of his new father, because that is how these things were done. More than half his life was spent as the person who was going to be emperor. We tend to think of that as an apprenticeship in ruling, and some of it was. But 23 years is far too long to be an apprenticeship in anything practical. What a person actually learns in that much waiting is something else. How to hold a position that has not arrived yet. How to keep faith with a version of yourself you have not met. How to talk yourself into being someone every morning without any external event confirming that it worked. Which is, when you look at it squarely, the exact activity he would spend the rest of his life doing on paper. Almost nothing survives from those quiet decades except letters, hundreds of them, to one man he loved past all reasonable proportion, and for 16 centuries nobody knew they existed at all. The house on that hill is gone. The hill is still there with other centuries built on top of it, and none of it would be recognizable to him now. The room you are lying in tonight will not last either, and you did not choose most of what put you in it. Not the hour, not the shape of the ceiling above you, not the long chain of small accidents that arranged for you to be awake in it at this particular time. All of that was settled without consulting you. What you do inside it is a separate question entirely, and it does not need answering tonight. The parchment was expensive, and the monastery needed parchment. So, at some point in the early Middle Ages, in a religious house in the hills of northern Italy, founded a century or so earlier by an Irish missionary, a man sat down with a knife and a pumice stone and began scraping a book clean. This was ordinary work. Animal skin took months to prepare and cost real money, and a codex full of writing nobody in the building could use was simply a stack of good material with something unhelpful on it. He scraped and washed and let it dry, and when the surface was pale enough, he handed it on to be written over. What came off were letters, a private correspondence between a Roman emperor and his old tutor, then about 600 years old. What went on in their place were the minutes of a church council, the long 5th century argument about the nature of Christ, copied out because that was the kind of thing worth having. He was not a vandal. He was a man with a job and a limited supply of skin, making the same judgment every generation makes without noticing it is making one about what is worth the shelf space, and he did the job badly, which is the only reason any of this exists. Scraped ink does not entirely leave. It sinks into the follicles of the skin and stays there as a shadow, and for something like 1,000 years those letters lay underneath the theology, invisible, waiting for light at the right angle. They got it in 1815. A young priest and librarian named Angelo Mai was working through the collection at the Ambrosian Library in Milan when he noticed the ghost of an older hand running beneath the newer one. He knew what he was looking at. Palimpsests were understood by then, and Mai had a gift for finding them. What he did not have was patience, or the technology to earn it. To bring the buried ink back up, he brushed the pages with a chemical tincture, which worked. The old writing rose out of the skin, brown and legible, and he copied as fast as he could. And then the tincture went on working. It darkened the parchment and kept darkening it, and the words he had not yet reached went down into the stain and did not come back. I have never been able to read about that calmly, and I have tried. Nothing irreplaceable was lost. We have most of what he transcribed, published in Rome 8 years later, and he turned up more of it afterward in the Vatican. It is just that they had come so far, buried by one man's ordinary mourning and raised by another's, and ruined in the raising, by someone who wanted them badly enough to be careless. What survived is more than 200 letters, about 80 of them in Marcus's own hand, and they contain a young man almost nobody would recognize. He is anxious about his throat, endlessly. He gargles and reports on the gargling. He is anxious about his tutor's health with a persistence that makes you feel slightly sorry for the older man who seems obliged to file bulletins. He describes ordinary days in the country in exhaustive and rather aimless detail. What he read, what he ate, how the farm workers were shouting at each other, how badly he slept, and for how long. He is funny in a way that has been scrubbed out of everything else he ever wrote. He is a tremendous show-off about words, and he signs off more than once like this: "Farewell, my Fronto, wherever you are, most honey-sweet, my love, my delight." Fronto was a provincial who had made it. He came from North Africa, arrived in Rome, and became the most admired speaker of his generation, a man whose reputation rested on being able to do anything at all with Latin. His surviving showpieces include a formal praise of smoke and dust, and a formal praise of negligence, which are exactly what they sound like, virtuoso exercises in making nothing whatsoever sound magnificent. He suffered from an arthritic condition that got steadily worse and left him, in his own account, barely able to move on bad days. He buried 5 children and wrote once with a flatness that is worse than weeping, that each of them died at a moment that left him childless all over again. That is the man a teenage heir to the empire was handed as a tutor, and the two of them wrote to each other for something like a decade with an intensity that has embarrassed classicists for 200 years. You can see why. Take the sentence about honey and delight, put it in English, put it in a modern mouth, and there is nothing ambiguous about it at all. In 2006, a classicist named Amy Richlin published a selection of the correspondence under the title Marcus Aurelius in Love, argued that the relationship was physical, and pointed out, correctly, that if these are what they appear to be, they are the only love letters that survive from the ancient world in either direction. The counter case is not weak, and anyone being honest has to give it room. Roman men wrote to each other in a register of desire that does not translate into our categories at all. Amor did work in Latin that love does not do in English, and elaborate declarations of longing between male friends were a convention with rules like a bow. There is also a piece of evidence that cuts both ways so cleanly it is almost annoying. Fronto composed for him a set speech in the voice of a man who is not in love, arguing that a beautiful young person ought to prefer the admirer who does not desire him, a deliberate imitation of a famous speech in Plato, which tells you the erotic register between them was, at least partly, a literary game they both knew they were playing, and which also tells you they were playing it. I do not know. I do not think anybody can. What I am reasonably confident of is that the affection was not performed, that whatever else the vocabulary was doing, a real attachment is sitting underneath it, of a kind that comes through the rhetoric rather than being made of it. Past that, we are looking at two men through a hole scraped in a page, and the honest position is that our questions may not be the shape of their lives. There is a smaller and more uncomfortable point in here too, which is that we are reading somebody's post. Not a book, not a speech, not anything either of them released. Private letters from a boy to his teacher, opened by strangers 1700 years later and argued over. Somewhere in your own history, there is probably a thing you wrote and would not want read aloud. A message sent at 3 in the morning, a page in a notebook, a draft never sent and never deleted either. Nobody consulted him about this. Nobody ever does. And here is where it turns into something more than a curiosity. When Marcus came, decades later, to write out the debts he owed to the people who had made him, he gave each of them a paragraph or two. His grandfather, his mother, his teachers, the emperor who adopted him. And Fronto, my love, my delight, wherever you are, gets a single sentence, and it is about politics. From Fronto, he wrote, I learned what envy and duplicity and hypocrisy look like in a ruler, and that the people we call aristocrats tend to be short on natural affection. That is the whole entry. You can read that as coldness, and some people do. I think it is something more interesting. The two documents are not two men. They are one man and two instruments. The letters are where he lived. The notebook is where he worked on himself. A set of instructions, not a confession. And by the time he was writing it, Fronto was decades dead, and Marcus was on a frozen frontier with an empire coming apart, and the notebook was not for keeping people in. Which means the famous calm of that later writing is not a temperature. It is a result. The man underneath it was the one who could not stop asking whether his tutor's knees were any better, who complained about his throat for pages, who used the word delight without visible embarrassment. Whatever was done to that man to produce the other one, it was done deliberately, over years, by him, to himself. He gave the words up in the end, not cleanly, and not all at once, The letters thin out, and the tone changes, and the boy who was drunk on language starts half apologizing for it. Later, listing what he was grateful to the gods for, he set down that he had never been swallowed whole by rhetoric or poetry, that he had been spared becoming a man of letters. It is a peculiar thing to be relieved about when you have written what he wrote to Fronto. Fronto lived long enough to watch it happen and did not pretend to be pleased about it. And the thing that took him was not an argument or a crisis or anything anyone said to him. It was a book taken down off a shelf and handed across a room by somebody else entirely. Your hands have been still for a while now. Nothing needs doing with them. And whatever it is that you have written and would not want read, it is not being read tonight. It is exactly where you left it, and it can stay there, and the dark has never once asked anybody about it. His name was not a name. In Greek, epiktetos means acquired, gained, added to the household inventory, and it is the ordinary word you would use for a thing that has come into your possession. Nobody troubled to write down what he had been called before that, because nobody would have thought there was anything to write down. He arrived in Rome as property sometime in the middle of the 1st century from a town in what is now Western Turkey, and the man who owned him was himself a former slave who had climbed all the way up to being one of the emperor's private secretaries. So he was the property of a piece of property that had done well. He was lame. There are 2 accounts of why, and the difference between them is worth sitting with for a moment. The famous one is that his master, in a temper, was twisting his leg, and that he observed calmly that it was going to break, and when it broke, said only, "I told you it would." The other account, from a much later commentator who had no obvious reason to lie, is that he had a childhood illness, and it left him with a bad hip. The second is almost certainly the true one, and I find the existence of the first genuinely interesting, because somebody, somewhere, needed the calm to have an origin. A man who taught that pain cannot reach the part of you that matters must have demonstrated it under torture, or else where did it come from? The dull answer, that he limped because he got sick as a child, the way people do, leaves the calm unexplained. And unexplained calm makes us uneasy enough that we go and build a story for it. The rest of the life is not much better documented and is, in its way, more remarkable. He was permitted, while still owned, to attend the lectures of a well-known Stoic teacher, which tells you something about the strange elasticity of a Roman household. He was freed at some point after Nero died. He taught in Rome until an emperor threw all the philosophers out of Italy, and then crossed to a small town on the west coast of Greece and taught there for the rest of his life, in conditions that were not a pose. He is said to have owned an iron lamp, which was stolen, and to have replaced it with an earthenware one on the grounds that a thief could hardly be blamed for taking the better object. Late in life, he took in an abandoned child and raised it. He never wrote anything. What we have was taken down in the lecture room by a student named Arrian, who went on to be a Roman governor and a fine historian in his own right, and who says in his preface that he simply wrote down what he heard as far as he could in the man's own words, and had not intended anybody else to see it. And here, near the front of what Arrian took down, is the sentence: "Some things are up to us, and some are not. Up to us are our judgments, our impulses, our desires and aversions. In short, whatever is our own doing. Not up to us are the body, property, reputation, position. In short, whatever is not our own doing. That is the whole of it. Everything else in the tradition is commentary, and the immediate consequence he draws is not soothing. If you treat the second pile as though it belonged in the first, you will be thwarted constantly. You will grieve. You will blame the gods and everybody around you, and you will be right to be miserable because you will have organized your life around a mistake. Sort them correctly, and nobody can compel you and nobody can obstruct you, not because your circumstances improve, but because you have stopped keeping your identity in a place other people can reach." Elsewhere, He puts it more compactly. People are disturbed not by things, but by their opinions about things. Now, the copy that ended up in Marcus's hands belonged to a man named Rusticus. Rusticus was not a philosopher by trade either. He was a senator, twice consul, eventually put in charge of the city of Rome, and he came from a family with a particular history. His own grandfather had been executed by an emperor for writing admiringly about a man who had refused to flatter one. That is the household this doctrine reached Marcus through. Not an academy. A family that had already found out what the second pile costs. Marcus was in his middle 20s, and the way he records the moment, decades afterward, is almost comically flat. Among the things he owed Rusticus, he set down that he had come to know the discourses of Epictetus from a copy Rusticus let him have out of his own collection. That is the entire account, the most consequential lending of a book in European history, filed as a clause in a list with no weight on it whatsoever. You can watch what it did to him in the letters, though. There is one from around this period in which he tells Fronto that he has been reading a Stoic writer named Aristo, and that the books are doing him good and harm at the same time. Good because they keep showing him what a person ought to be, and harm because they keep showing him how far short he falls, so that he spends a good deal of his reading time blushing at himself. That is a 25-year-old writing to the man who taught him to make anything at all sound magnificent, to say that he has found something that makes him ashamed. Fronto did not take it well, and there is no reason he should have. He had spent a decade teaching a boy that language was the highest human accomplishment, and the boy had just been handed a book which argues, page after page, that plain speech is the only honest kind, and that people who admire their own sentences are usually hiding. Before going further, I want to put the objection at full weight, because it is the strongest thing anyone has ever said against this tradition, and it has never really been answered. Look again at what the sentence puts in the second pile: the body, property, reputation, position, which is to say, illness, poverty, disgrace, and powerlessness, very nearly a complete inventory of the things that actually wreck human lives. A doctrine that opens by moving every genuine catastrophe into the column marked "not yours" has, in a single move, made itself impossible to disprove and made you responsible for your own suffering. Your child dies. The death is not up to you, but your grief is, and so the grief becomes a failure of technique. It is not obvious that this is wisdom. It has a decent claim to be cruelty with excellent manners. The political version is sharper. A philosophy whose first act is to relocate every grievance into the interior will never in its life produce a difficult subject. It is beautifully suited to the convenience of anyone who would prefer you not make trouble, and the man who formulated it had been somebody's property, and it did not free him. What it did was make him able to bear not being free. There is a way of reading that which is magnificent, and a way of reading it which is precisely what every slaveholder in history would most have liked his slaves to believe, and the two readings are not easy to prize apart. What can be said back is not a refutation, but it is not nothing either. The discourses are not a manual for contentment. In places, they are savage, full of open contempt for people who fawn, who flatter, who arrange their whole lives around the mood of someone with power over them. He was not telling anyone to be satisfied. He was telling them that the one room a tyrant cannot enter is the room where you decide what things mean. And for a man in his position that was not a consolation prize, it was the only form of resistance actually available, and he seems to have known exactly how small it was, and to have used it anyway. And then there is the fact that ought to be strange and somehow never gets remarked on, which is that the most consequential reader this doctrine ever found was not a slave, he was the owner of the world. Read the sentence from that end, and it does entirely different work. To a man who has nothing, it says, they cannot take the only thing you have. To a man who has everything, it says, almost none of this is yours. The legions are not his. The provinces are not his, not in the sense the word usually carries. His health was never his in the first place. His reputation is other people's property and always will be. The 2 decades he spent waiting were never his to spend, and the child who will inherit all of it is not his to keep. The identical sentence at opposite ends of the same empire, arriving as relief for one man and as demolition for the other. That does not dispose of the objection. It might even sharpen it, since there is something a little too convenient about a man with absolute power discovering that power was never really his. But it does finish off the laziest version of the complaint that this is a philosophy for the beaten. Nobody less beaten has ever picked it up. You could try it if there is anything left of you tonight to try it with. Something has your attention at this hour, or you would be asleep already. Take that specific thing, not your whole life, just the one thing, and split it. What is going to happen whether or not you participate, and what is still genuinely yours to do or not do? Most of it goes into the first pile, which is unpleasant, and what remains in the second is almost always smaller and duller than you were braced for. A conversation you could have, an apology you could make, a decision to stop looking at something. That is the entire exercise. It is not comforting, it is only accurate. I have circled this for years, and I still cannot tell you whether the sorting is true or merely useful. There are days when that distinction seems to me the only thing worth arguing about, and days when it seems like nothing at all, and I have noticed the days sort themselves according to how the week has gone, which is probably the least philosophical fact about me. He was around 25 when that book came down off the shelf. He would have roughly 30 years to find out whether any of it held, and the real testing would not begin until a spring morning some 15 years later, when a mild old man who had never once made his life difficult stopped breathing and left him the world. The sorting can wait. It is better done in daylight anyway, when the first pile always turns out to be smaller than it looks from here. Everything is larger at this hour, which is one of the few completely reliable facts about the dark. Whatever you were about to put in whichever column will still be there in the morning. And if it is not, then it was never yours to sort in the first place. He ate too much cheese. That, at any rate, is the reason given by a Roman biographer with a poor record for accuracy, and it has the particular ring of a detail nobody would bother to invent. At dinner, on an estate about 12 miles outside Rome, in the first week of March in the year 161, a man of 74 who had held the empire since before most of his soldiers were born, and had held it so quietly that historians have struggled ever since to find anything to say about him, helped himself rather too enthusiastically to some Alpine cheese. He was sick in the night. By the following morning he had a fever, and he did not get up again. On the third day, he understood what was happening and did the 2 things that were left. He called in the council and his friends and formally commended Marcus to them, which was the constitutional act. Then he had the golden statue of Fortune that stood in the emperor's bedchamber, as it had stood in whoever's bedchamber for longer than anyone could remember, carried out of his room and down the corridor into Marcus's. And then, because the ordinary business of a Roman knight carried on regardless of who was dying in it, the tribune of the watch came in for the password. The emperor gave him one word: equanimitas, aequanimitas, evenness of mind. After that, he turned over as though he intended to sleep and stopped. Hold all of it loosely. The sources here are late and in places demonstrably fictional, and I would not put money on the cheese. But the watchword surfaces in more than one place, and it is exactly the sort of thing that gets remembered accurately, because everyone standing in the room heard it. For one night, in that corner of Italy, The word a soldier had to give at a doorway to prove he was not a stranger was equanimity. Marcus was 6 weeks short of 40. What he did next has no precedent in Roman history, and the absence of precedent is easy to walk straight past because we are used to the idea of two emperors. The Senate offered him everything in the ordinary way. He refused it unless the same powers were given to Lucius Verus. Rome had been ruled by one man at a time for nearly 2 centuries. The whole apparatus, legal and religious and military, was shaped around a single figure. Marcus made it 2 on his first day by his own choice, and he did it for a man who had been visibly passed over for a very long time. Lucius was 9 years younger, the son of the heir who had died on New Year's Day when they were both children, and he had been adopted into the family on the same afternoon Marcus was. What happened afterward was that Antoninus groomed one of them and left the other more or less alone. Honours, offices, the ordinary progression of a well-born young man, but never the position of designated successor. For 23 years, everyone in Rome knew which of the 2 brothers the empire was waiting for. Then Marcus stood up and handed the other one half of it. The hostile accounts of Lucius are enjoyable and probably unfair. He liked chariot racing to a degree that embarrassed people, and there was a famous horse he doted on, which was stabled in the palace, wore a purple blanket, and was fed on raisins and nuts. He kept a livelier household than his brother and made no apologies for it. What the hostile accounts do not manage to establish is that he was useless, because he was not. He held the Eastern Command for 5 years, and the war there was won. As for why Marcus did it, there are 3 explanations and no way at all to choose between them. The generous one is that he simply thought it was right. The 2 boys had been adopted and only one had been promoted, and he was correcting an old imbalance. The dutiful one is that he was honouring the design of the dying emperor who had assembled the whole arrangement when they were children and considered himself bound by it. And the cold one is that a passed-over adoptive brother, popular with the army, with a legitimate claim and access to legions, is a civil war standing in your house waiting to be offered a drink, and that sharing was the cheapest way to buy him. These are not mutually exclusive, and I suspect they were not exclusive inside Marcus either. The reward arrived almost immediately. Within months of the accession, the Roman governor on the Armenian frontier, encouraged by a fashionable religious fraud who had assured him the campaign would be straightforward, marched an entire legion into Armenia and lost it. He killed himself. Parthian forces came down into Syria. 23 years in which nothing happened, followed by a disaster within the year, and along with it, in Rome itself, the river came up over its banks, and the city went hungry. Which brings us to the thing this whole stretch of his life is really about, and I want to state it properly rather than gesture at it. He had absolute power, not the negotiated, committee-bound, appealable power of a modern head of government, but personal and final authority over something like 60 million people, an economy running on forced labour, an arena in which men were killed for entertainment on public holidays, and a permanent machinery of conquest at the edges. He held it for 19 years. And the private notebook he kept throughout is, from one end to the other, a set of instructions about not being disturbed. There is an obvious name for what that looks like from outside. A philosophy whose central move is to relocate every grievance into the interior and to define a good life as the correct management of your own reactions is a philosophy that will make a ruler serene and will not, at any point, make him dangerous to the arrangement he is sitting on. The same doctrine that told a slave they cannot reach your judgment told the man who owned him, your judgment is the part that matters, and both of them could get to sleep. And the charge sharpens considerably when you notice what this particular school actually taught. They were not a group who believed some people are naturally property. They held, explicitly and often, that every human being has the same reason in them, that the differences between us are external and incidental, and that the world is a single community to which all rational creatures belong. They had the premise in writing for 400 years. Nobody took the step. Failing to see an argument is one thing. Holding the first half of it in your hand for 4 centuries and setting it down is another. What can be put on the other side is real, and it would be dishonest to shortchange it. He used the power. The legal record of his reign is unusually full, and it leans consistently in one direction. Rulings in ambiguous cases were to favor freedom, and the limits on what an owner could do to a slave were tightened. He created an official whose entire job was the guardianship of orphans and minors, which sounds like administration and was, for a fatherless child in a Roman family, the difference between being looked after and being quietly robbed. He extended the sitting days of the courts until they ran to 230 in the year, and then sat in them himself at length, hearing cases that had nothing whatever to do with him. And he is reported to have told the Senate that it was more reasonable for him to follow the advice of many good friends than for many good friends to follow the will of one man. I have read that line a dozen times and still cannot hear it cleanly. It is either a genuine constitutional conviction or an extremely well-chosen thing to say, and I think it may be both at once. But none of it touches the structure. Every single one of those measures is exactly the reform a decent man makes when he has no intention of altering the arrangement, the humane administration of an unjust thing. He never questioned that there should be slaves. He never questioned that Rome should rule or that the frontier should be held by killing the people on the other side of it. He disliked the arena and attended anyway, and was mocked at the time for reading his correspondence in the imperial box while the killing went on below, which is either the best detail about him or the worst, depending entirely on your mood when you hear it. The usual defense is that no one in the ancient world proposed abolishing slavery, that there was no available vantage point from which the thought could even be assembled, and that convicting a 2nd century Roman of failing to be a 19th century abolitionist is a mistake about how history works. That defense is broadly correct. It is also precisely why the charge stays alive rather than settling, because he was not just any 2nd century Roman. He belonged to the one school that had already written down the premise. Stand where he was standing that spring, though, before deciding. You are 39. You have spent every adult year being told that this would be yours, in a queue behind a man who kept not dying, and now he has died over a plate of cheese, and the Senate is in front of you, offering the world. And the first thing you do with it is give half away to a brother who has not earned it, on the strength of a plan drawn up by a dying man when you were both boys. Whether that was virtue or arithmetic, I am not sure he could have told you himself. That is the genuinely uncomfortable part. People almost never have clean access to their own motives at the exact moment they are being admirable, which is inconvenient, since those are the moments we most want the accounting to be clear. The Eastern War was won in the end by generals whose names have mostly gone. In October of 166, the two brothers rode through Rome together in a triumph, with the children up on the chariot beside them and the whole city out. And somewhere back in the column, in the baggage and the men and the crowded ships that had brought them home, something had come west with the army that would do more damage to the empire than the Parthians had ever managed. I keep returning at this hour to how small that last piece of business was. Not the statue, not the council, not the empire changing hands. The password. One word handed to a soldier at a door so that in the dark a friend could be told apart from a stranger. You are not far from that yourself now. The thinking has probably begun to go loose, sentences arriving slightly out of order, words coming unstuck from the things they mean. That is not attention failing. That is the door. And if one word wants to come through it with you, you could do considerably worse than the one that man gave away with the last of his breath. Something arrives, a message, a name on a screen, a particular tone in somebody's voice as you come through a door, and before you have finished taking it in, your chest has tightened and something low in your stomach has dropped an inch. Notice the order of that. The reaction did not wait for you to think it over, and it did not wait for the second half of the sentence. Whatever assessment got made was made at a speed you have no access to, by something that does not ask permission, and by the time the deliberate part of you arrives, the verdict has been handed down and the body is already carrying it out. The Stoics had this mapped with a precision that is genuinely startling for people with no way of looking inside a head. Their account runs like this. An appearance arrives, a sight, a sound, a sentence, and it does not arrive neutral. It comes carrying a claim already formed. Not merely there is a message, but this is bad, and it is bad for me, and something has gone wrong. You did not compose that claim, and you cannot stop it presenting itself. What happens next is that you either ratify it or you don't, and the ratifying is a separate act, however fast it goes past. They were careful about the physical side too, which is the part people usually miss. The later Stoics had a term for the first movements, the pallor when a door slams, the sudden wet in the eyes at a story about somebody else's child, the lurch before you have decided anything. And they were explicit that these happen to everyone, including the wisest person they could imagine. Nobody claimed you could stop the flinch. The claim was narrower and stranger, that the flinch is not yet the judgment. It is the summons. What is up to you is whether you go. Marcus puts it about as compactly as it can be put. Take away the opinion, and you have taken away the complaint, I have been harmed. Take away the complaint, and the harm has gone. Hold on to that sentence, because it is where all the trouble is. Now, the same machinery runs in the other direction, and that is where he does something genuinely peculiar. If a judgment is what makes an insult hurt, then a judgment is also what makes a thing worth wanting, and the same tool that takes the sting out of the first will take the shine off the second. So he writes down an exercise. When you are sitting in front of good food, keep a plain description running underneath it. This is the corpse of a fish. That is the corpse of a bird or a pig. The Falernian Fou l'air né an, the most sought-after wine in the empire, aged for decades, the sort of thing a Roman host announced before he poured it, is grape juice. The purple robe is sheep's wool that has been dipped in the blood of a shellfish. And sex is the rubbing together of pieces of gut, a convulsion, and a small discharge. That is not a paraphrase. It is very close to what is on the page, and it is worth being still for a moment with the fact that it was written by a middle-aged head of state in private to nobody, with no argument to win and no one to shock. The purple is the line to stay with, because it is the one that is not a metaphor at all. Roman purple came out of a sea snail. Not a plant, not a mineral, a shellfish harvested in enormous quantities with the dye taken from a single small gland. The yields were absurd. You needed thousands upon thousands of animals to colour one garment, which is most of why the stuff cost what it cost, and the process stank. The glands were left to rot in vats in the sun as part of the preparation, and the smell was so notorious that dye works were pushed outside city walls by law and by common agreement, and Pliny, writing about it 100 years before Marcus, could not get through the description without complaining about the odour. Meanwhile, the wearing of it was regulated to the point of absurdity. Full purple was effectively the emperor's own colour. It was the single most restricted, most expensive, most instantly legible object in the Roman world. And what it actually was, physically, was wool soaked in the rotted secretions of sea snails, and everybody involved in making it knew that, and it smelled. He was wearing it while he wrote that down. That is the part that keeps the passage from being a sermon. He is not sneering at somebody else's luxury. He is looking at his own sleeve. Here is the trouble, though, and it is serious. Describe a kiss as friction between membranes, and you have not become more accurate. You have selected a level of description at which everything that made it what it was has been filtered out on the way through, and the move works on anything you like. A symphony is variations in air pressure. A child's face is a particular arrangement of fat over bone. The person you would run into a burning building for is protein and water. Every one of those sentences is true. Every one of them is a decision about which true sentence to utter, and the decision is doing all the work. Reduction feels like the removal of illusion mainly because it is unpleasant, and we have a very old habit of mistaking unpleasantness for honesty. So it is at minimum an open question whether the man in front of the roast bird is seeing through his dinner or simply declining to look at it. And the technical claim underneath is worse when you follow it out. Remove the opinion and the harm is gone, which means the harm was located in the opinion the entire time. Which means that if something is done to you and you succeed in not forming the judgment, then in the relevant sense, nothing was done. Say that out loud in front of somebody who has actually been harmed and listen to what it sounds like. It is the most efficient instrument for dismissing an injury that anyone has ever constructed, and it runs exactly as smoothly when you point it at somebody else's injury as when you point it at your own. Two things can be said back, and neither of them is a rescue. The first is that the exercise is a counterweight, not a picture of reality, and counterweights only make sense against a particular load. He is not asserting that the robe is nothing but wool. He is asserting that a man who is about to do something stupid or cruel because he wants the robe is, in that moment, operating under a flattering misdescription, and that the flat account is the available antidote. You do not evaluate a counterweight by hanging it in empty air and observing that it pulls one way. The second is a matter of where he aims it. It goes at what he wants and never at what he owes. Across the whole of that notebook, there is no passage in which the plain description is used to conclude that another person does not matter, or that an obligation can be dissolved by being accurately restated. He turns it on his own appetite and his own status and leaves duty alone. He never announces that as a rule. It is simply where he stops, every time, for 12 books. I have used this, by the way. It works. That is not a recommendation, and I want to be careful about how I put it, because what unsettles me about the exercise is not any suspicion that it fails. The tool has no stopping mechanism inside it. If you can talk yourself out of the sting of an insult, you can talk yourself out of the pleasure of a meal. And if out of that, then out of the pull of a particular face across a table. And there is nothing anywhere in the technique that puts up a hand and says, "That will do, leave the rest alone." What tells you when to stop applying the judgment corrector is a judgment, which is circular, and which is also, if you look honestly at any practice anyone has ever kept up, any discipline of running or praying or fasting or staying sober, precisely how it always is. The thing that tells you when you have gone too far is never located inside the method. You can catch the mechanism working if you want to, and this is a reasonable hour for it, because everything is running slower now. Something will arrive, a thought about tomorrow, a conversation from 4 years ago that has decided to replay itself, and the tightening will come first, the way it always does. See whether you can get into the gap, not to argue with anything, only to notice that between the thing appearing and you agreeing that it is a catastrophe, there was a moment, and you were technically in the room for it. Whether a tool is any good is not settled by how it performs on a message at midnight. It is settled by what it survives. He had been carrying this one since his 20s and had something like 25 years to practice it in comfortable conditions, in a stone house with his family alive. Within a couple of years, he would find out what it was actually worth, over a run of months that took very nearly everything he had left to lose. Try the plain description on the room, though, not on your life, just on the room. There is a certain volume of air at a certain temperature. There is a ceiling somewhere above you that you cannot currently see. Some furniture is standing exactly where you left it, doing nothing whatsoever, and outside there is either traffic or there isn't. That is a complete and accurate account of your situation, and there is no emergency anywhere in it. Whatever else this room has been carrying for the last hour, you were the one supplying it, and you are allowed to stop. They were in a carriage going south. It was the winter of 169, and the two emperors were travelling back toward Italy from a garrison town near the head of the Adriatic, where they had spent an unhappy season on a border that would not stay where it was put. There had been friction between them about it. Lucius wanted Rome. Marcus wanted to stay near the trouble. They had compromised, as they had been compromising for 8 years, and they were on the road. Somewhere along it, Lucius stopped being able to speak. The accounts describe a sudden seizure that took his speech and left him conscious. A stroke, in the language we would use. They got him as far as a town called Altinum, out on the marshes where Venice would eventually be built, and he lay there 3 days without being able to say anything to anybody, and then he died. He was 38. Consider what those 3 days actually were. Not unconsciousness. The accounts are clear that he was awake in there and following it. A man lying in a room he had been carried into, hearing everything that was said over him, understanding all of it, and unable to send one word back. Anyone who has sat beside a bed like that knows the particular quality of that silence, and knows that the hardest part is not the not speaking. It is that you keep talking anyway, and there is no way on earth to tell how much of it is arriving. Marcus brought the body back to Rome himself. He conducted the funeral, saw the whole business through, and had the Senate declare him a god, which was the ordinary courtesy, and was also, in this particular case, an argument. Whatever anyone had been saying for 8 years about the co-emperorship being a fiction, the official record was going to show that the colleague had been real. The rumours started immediately, the way they always do. Poison in all the usual varieties, from his wife, from Marcus, from Marcus's wife. There is nothing behind any of it, and the likeliest explanation is the dullest, and by some distance the worst, which is that whatever had come west with the army 3 years earlier had finally reached him, as it was reaching everyone. The empire he came back to that spring was not in a condition anybody had planned for, and the money had gone. So in the Forum of Trajan, the grandest and most conspicuous public space in the city, he put the imperial household up for auction and let it run for 2 months. Crystal, gold plate, statues by sculptors whose names people knew, furniture inlaid with gold, and his wife's robes, the silk ones worked through with gold thread, along with her jewellery. Anybody with money could turn up and buy the emperor's furniture. It is either the most modest thing a Roman emperor ever did, or the most carefully staged. And I suspect he would have said the distinction was not worth having, since either way the money went north and the tax collectors stayed home. And then, on the 10th of September, the year finished what it had started. His son was 7. The boy had a tumour under one ear, and the doctors decided to take it out, which in the 2nd century meant a knife, and no anaesthetic worth the word, and a child held down by adults. The operation itself seems to have gone as well as such things went. He died afterwards, of what we would now file under complications. His name was Marcus Annius Verus. It had been his father's birth name, and his grandfather's, and his great-grandfather's. The name that household had been handing forward for 4 generations, given to a boy who had been made a Caesar at 4 years old because he was meant to carry it further. There is a late report from the same unreliable biography that gave us the story about the cheese that Marcus mourned him for 5 days and then went back to the business of the empire. I have no idea whether it is true. It has the shape of something an admirer would invent and the shape of something an enemy would invent, which is the permanent problem with that whole genre of writing. He was not the first, either. Faustina bore something like 13 children over the course of the marriage, and by that September, roughly half of them were already dead. A boy of 4 had gone 4 years earlier, one of a pair of twins born in the first year of the reign. His brother lived. Others were infants whose names survive on inscriptions and in no other place on earth. None of which made him unusual, and that is the part a modern listener finds hardest to hold steady. In the Roman world, something close to half of all children died before they were 10, and every household in the empire, the emperors and the brickmakers alike, was built on top of a small private graveyard. That does not mean it hurt less. It means everybody was carrying it continuously and had to find some way of remaining upright while they did. Which brings us to the sentence in this tradition that has appalled people for 2,000 years. I'm not going to soften it, because softening it would be a species of lie. In the little handbook of Epictetus's teaching, there is an instruction about attachment. If you are fond of a jug, it says, tell yourself that what you are fond of is a jug. Then when it breaks, you will not be thrown. And then, with no change of register at all, no pause, no acknowledgement that the ground has shifted. If you kiss your child or your wife, tell yourself that you are kissing a human being. Then, when either of them dies, you will not be thrown. A wife and a child, in the same paragraph as a piece of pottery, filed under the same principle. Marcus copied a version of it into his own notebook. When you are kissing your child, he wrote, quoting his teacher, whisper to yourself, tomorrow perhaps you will die. Take that at face value, and the philosophy is instructing a father to withdraw from his own children in advance in order to be protected from losing them. It is asking him to hold a 7-year-old slightly at arm's length for 7 years, so that on one particular afternoon in September he will be able to keep his face still. That is not wisdom. That is a man selling his son's entire childhood to buy insurance against a single bad day at a catastrophic exchange rate. The defense is better than it looks, though it takes some care to lay out. They were not, as a school, in favor of feeling nothing, and their working vocabulary is a good deal more careful than their reputation. They separated 3 things. There are the first involuntary movements, the lurch, the wet eyes, the pallor, which happen to everyone including the wisest person they could imagine, and which carry no moral weight whatever. There are the destructive passions, which they thought were mistaken judgments wearing the costume of feelings. And there are the good feelings, which the wise person genuinely has. Seneca, the most humane of them on this subject, wrote to a friend in mourning that the tears should be allowed to come and then allowed to stop, and what he actually objected to was grief that had turned into a performance, and grief that was being deliberately kept going because letting it ease felt like an act of betrayal. And the target was never the sorrow. The target was the thing that arrives alongside it, the conviction that this ought not to have happened, that some order which owed you better has broken faith, that you have been personally cheated by the arrangement of the world. Remove that, and what is left is not numbness. It is sorrow without grievance. Anyone who has been through a bad loss and come out the far side of it will tell you that sorrow without grievance is more or less what it eventually becomes anyway, in the people who survive. The Stoics were trying to arrive there deliberately and early, which is either admirable or impossible and might be both. It also matters enormously that this was a philosophy built for a world in which half the children died. A doctrine that told a Roman parent their grief was an error would have been laughed out of the room and deserved to be. A doctrine that told them their grief was not evidence that the universe had failed may have been the only thing anyone had to offer. So, Where was he, in fact? There is one passage that gets closer than any of the famous ones, and it is easy to walk past. He is writing about prayer and about how people habitually ask for the wrong thing. One man prays, "How am I not to lose my little son?" And Marcus sets down the prayer he thinks that man ought to be making instead. "How am I not to be afraid of losing him?" Consider what it takes to write that. It is not the sentence of somebody who has solved the problem. It is the sentence of a man who has buried several children, one of them 7 years old with a fresh incision below the ear, and who has concluded that the dread was doing damage on top of the losses, and who is trying to get the dread out while knowing with total clarity that the losses will keep arriving. It does not say the loss is nothing. It says the fear you carry in advance is a second injury, and that one, at least, is optional. Whether it worked on him, I do not know, and this is the chapter where the not knowing sits worst with me. He went back to work. He went back to the frontier. He also went on writing the same instructions to himself for another decade, which can be read in either direction and always could. A man who has genuinely stopped being afraid does not need to write it down every year. A man doing something difficult does. I have never found a way of choosing between those two readings that did not finally come down to what I wanted to be true about him, which is not a good enough reason for anything. Stand in the September, if you can bear to. You are 48 years old. In January, you buried the man you had made your equal against every precedent in Roman history, and you carried him home. Since then, you have sold your household in public to keep an army in the field. It is now autumn, and a boy carrying your name and your father's name has died on a table, and there is a frontier 800 miles to the north that does not care, and in a few weeks you will be on the road back to it. You have a philosophy for exactly this. You have had it since you were 25. Tonight you find out what it is made of, and there is no one you can tell. What he wrote afterwards is not, for the most part, consolation. A great deal of it is a list. Names put down one after another, whole households of them, people who had been the most important men alive and were now simply not anything. He seems to have found the list steadying, which is a strange sort of comfort and worth understanding. Whatever you came in carrying tonight, and most people awake at this hour are carrying something or they would not be awake, see if you can find where it actually sits. It is nearly always somewhere physical, the top of the chest, the back of the throat, a tightness behind the eyes that has been there long enough to stop registering as tightness. You are not being asked to put it down, only to notice that for the next few hours, nothing at all is going to require you to hold it up. It will keep. That kind of thing always keeps. It was illegal to bury anyone inside the city. The rule went back to the oldest Roman law code and was observed for centuries, which meant the dead had to go somewhere, and where they went was the roads. Every highway out of Rome ran for miles between them. Tombs, altars, family monuments, and the cheap communal vaults where a burial club would file 100 urns into niches in the wall, so many and so regular that the Romans named the buildings after dovecotes. They crowded up against the verge and competed for frontage, because a tomb on a busy road gets read and a tomb in a field does not. And they talked to you. Roman epitaphs are written in the first person and addressed directly to whoever is walking past. Stop, traveller, stranger, stand and read. One of the commonest of all says, with no softening at all, what you are, I was. What I am, you will be. Another was so common it was abbreviated to 7 letters, the way we would abbreviate a phrase everyone already knows. Spelled out, it runs, I was not, I was, I am not, I do not care. Hold on to that one. It is not what it looks like, and we will come back to it. So every Roman who went anywhere, to a farm, to a war, to dinner in the next town, left the city through a corridor of the dead, speaking to him by name. This was not considered morbid. It was simply where the dead were kept, in the same way that we keep them in a fenced field on the edge of town and drive past without turning our heads. And among the standard formulae, alongside the requests to stop and read and the assurances that the earth lies light, there was one that turns up often enough to have become a phrase. It marks a tomb with no one left to visit it. The last of his line. Marcus knew that inscription, and he built a passage around it. The court of Augustus, he writes. His wife, his daughter, the grandsons, the stepsons, the sister, Agrippa, the relatives, the household, the close friends, his philosopher. Maecenas, the great patron, the man who found Virgil and Horace and paid for them, the doctors, the men who ran the sacrifices, a whole court, dead. Notice what kind of list that is. He does not name emperors and generals. He goes down through the staff. The physicians who attended the most important family in the world, the priests who managed its religious calendar, people who were somebody to somebody, whose position in the room was perfectly clear to everyone in it, and who went into the ground alongside the principals with the whole apparatus of who matters intact and useless. Then he moves on. Not the death of one person, he writes, but of an entire family. And then the inscription, the last of his line, and then the sentence that stops me every time I come to it. Consider, he says, all the anxiety of the people who came before, the arranging, the strategizing, the whole apparatus of making sure there would be an heir. And then it turns out that somebody has to be the last one. The man performing that calculation had, within the previous few years, stood at the grave of the boy who was carrying his family's name forward. There is another passage in the same key that is stranger and, in a way, worse. It is a chain of names, and the pattern never varies. This person buried that one, and then this person was buried. Somebody saw somebody else die, and then died. On it goes for several lines, one pair after another, survivors becoming the next thing to be survived. And here is what has happened to that passage. Scholars cannot securely identify most of the people in it. He wrote down a list of names to remind himself that names go, and the names went. Some of them may have been his own household, nobody can say. Whoever they were real to him, and are now nothing but the rhythm of a sentence, which is more or less exactly the demonstration he was after, delivered by time itself rather than by him, a couple of centuries late. He was writing this in the middle of an epidemic. We do not know what it was. The best current guess is smallpox, though nobody has yet recovered a genome from the period to settle it, and measles has not been ruled out. What we have is a clinical description from the finest doctor of the age, who was there. Galen was summoned to the army camps in the north in the winter of 168, where the disease had got into the packed quarters and was killing soldiers faster than any enemy had managed. He describes fever and a black rash spreading over the whole body, and ulcers and scabs that dried and fell away around the 12th day in the ones who lived. He noted that black in the stools meant the patient would not live. He watched a great many people die and wrote it down carefully because that was what he had. How many died across the empire is genuinely unknown, and the responsible estimates diverge by a factor of 10, which tells you something about how thin the evidence is. What is not in doubt is the shape of it. The armies were gutted so badly that Marcus enrolled gladiators and Danubian bandits into the legions to fill the ranks, which was close to unthinkable. In Rome, when the bodies outran the family's ability to bury them, he paid for the funerals of the poor out of public money. And somewhere in those years, he wrote down a sentence that can be read two completely opposite ways. The corruption of a mind, he says, is far more a plague than any disturbance in the air around us. The second is a plague to us as animals. The first is a plague to us as human beings. Read that in the wrong mood, and it is close to obscene. A man in a palace announcing that the real epidemic is bad character, while carts go past outside with bodies stacked on them. Read it from inside his actual position, and it becomes something else. Here is a man who cannot stop the disease, cannot cure a single case of it, has already lost people to it, and is casting round for the one thing left in the world he might still have any authority over. He is not saying the plague doesn't matter. He is saying that it is not the thing he can act on, and that there is something else which is. Which brings us back to the sentence on the tombstones. I was not, I was, I am not, I do not care. That is not a shrug. That is a doctrine compressed to fit on a stone, and the doctrine is Epicurus. His argument is one of the cleanest anybody has ever made. Everything good and everything bad, he says, consists in sensation. Death is the end of sensation. So death is nothing to us, not a bad thing we should be brave about, but a non-event, a place where there is nobody left for anything to happen to. Where death is, I am not. Where I am, death is not. And he adds the symmetry. There was an eternity before you existed, and it never troubled you for a moment, so why should the matching eternity on the other side be different? And there is a second half to it, which is political. Live unnoticed, he taught. Get out of public life. Public life manufactures anxieties that have nothing whatever to do with living well. Reputation, position, the good opinion of people you don't like, and it will consume you while promising you significance. Buy a small piece of ground. Keep a few good friends. Grow something. Now put those two halves together and point them at Marcus, because they go straight through him. An Epicurean would look at that man and see somebody who has made every available error simultaneously. He rehearses death daily, which is not clear sight but a scheduled fright, a man frightening himself on purpose and filing the result under wisdom. He has accepted responsibility for 60 million people he cannot help. He has stayed at the head of an empire through an epidemic he cannot cure and a war he cannot finish, at a cost that has already taken his colleague and several of his children. And when the accounts are finally drawn up, the people died anyway, in whatever numbers they died. So, what did the extra suffering buy? That is not a rhetorical question, and it does not have an obvious answer. And this is not a straw man set up to be knocked over. Marcus quotes Epicurus more than once, always with respect, on how to handle pain, on how a philosopher should behave when he is ill. He knew the alternative, and he thought well of the man who built it. He simply did not take it. His answer, such as it is, comes in a passage about wanting to get away. People go looking for places to retreat to, he writes, houses in the country, stretches of coast, the mountains, and you have wanted that yourself, badly. Then he says, this is the most ordinary thing in the world to want, and it is entirely unnecessary, because you can withdraw into yourself at any hour you choose, and there is nowhere quieter or less interrupted than a man's own mind. That is a direct reply to the garden, and on the face of it, a rather thin one. You cannot leave, so you will do your leaving internally. It has the sound of a man making the best of a thing that has no best in it, except that there was an exit, and he declined to use it. Nobody obliged a Roman emperor to sleep in a frontier camp. Plenty of them ran the empire from comfortable rooms and let other men hold the rivers, and no one thought less of them for it. That was in fact the normal arrangement. He went north and stayed north for most of the rest of his life, and the nearest thing he ever offers to a reason is not an argument at all. It is that the work was in front of him and was his, which is when the list stops looking like what it looked like. It is not there to frighten him. It is a proportioning instrument. When you have buried a colleague and a child inside a single year and are expected to get up and govern regardless, the dead court of Augustus is not a threat. It is a change of scale. Everyone in that list was enormous to somebody. All of them went in together, ranks and reputations included. And if that is what happens to the largest thing there has ever been, then whatever is presently sitting on your chest is a smaller object than it feels at 4 in the morning. There is a real question buried in all of this, and it is worth putting to yourself now while nobody is listening. If somebody offered you the exit, the small life, the garden, no one depending on you, nothing on your shoulders that could not be set down, would you take it? Most people say no and mean it, and then cannot explain themselves at all. I have asked myself that question more than once, and I do not trust my answer, because I notice it changes depending on how tired I am. The Epicurean has never had a good account of why anyone says no. Neither, honestly, has anybody else. But a list only works if you can stand far enough back to take it in at once, and a man in a tent on a river has no hill high enough for that. So he built one. There is something that happens right at the edge of sleep, and it may be starting for you now. Names go first. Not images, not the sense of a person, the names. The word arrives half a second late, and then it doesn't arrive, and you find you are thinking about somebody perfectly clearly without having their name available, and it does not trouble you in the smallest degree. Every night, without any effort, you rehearse a mild and completely unfrightening version of the thing carved on all those stones, and every morning it is handed back to you. Let it go now. It comes back. Only 2 places are named in the whole of that notebook. 12 books, several hundred separate entries, written across something like a decade, and in all of it, 2 lines that tell you where the man was sitting. One reads, "At Carnuntum." The other reads, "Among the Quadi, on the river Granua." Carnuntum was a legionary fortress, and the town that had grown up around it, on the south bank of the Danube, about 25 miles east of where Vienna stands now. He was there roughly 3 years. The Quadi, were a Germanic people living on the far side of the river, and the Granua runs down through what is now Slovakia, which means that one of the 2 entries was written on the wrong side of his own frontier, in country that was not his, with an army around him. So the book that now gets sold as a guide to a serene life was composed in large part in a room made of cloth, in a fortified camp, in his 50s, with a war he could not finish on one side of him, and an epidemic he could not stop moving through the men on the other. Start there if you like. It is a good place to start from. There is a lamp because it is night, and night is when there was any time. The air smells of oil and wet wool and horses. Outside there is the ordinary settling noise of a camp, somebody hammering something, a voice, then not a voice. Past the ditch and the bank and the timber wall, the ground slopes down to the river, and in the cold months the river is not really a river, it is a road. It freezes hard enough to carry cavalry, which is the reason nobody on that frontier sleeps well between November and March. Now go up, not far at first, just far enough that the camp stops being a place and becomes a shape. And it is a shape. A long rectangle with rounded corners and 2 straight roads crossing in the middle, laid out to the same plan as every other camp in the empire, so that a man transferred from Syria could arrive in the dark and still find the headquarters building without asking. Fires in rows, horses in lines, smoke going sideways, higher. The river becomes a line, and the line turns out to be the edge of something. On one side of it, forts every few miles, a road running the length of it, ditches, granaries, watchtowers, an entire administrative membrane holding a shape. On the other side, forest and clearings, and villages of people who have been there a very long time and can see perfectly well that the grazing is better across the water. Higher still, and it stops being a frontier at all and becomes one seam in something much larger. The Alps come up white to the south, and past them the long boot of Italy with the sea on both sides of it, and past that more sea, and the grain ports of Africa, and away west the cold green edge of Britain with a wall across the neck of it, and east through the mountains and the deserts to where the roads simply stop. And now, hold it there. Do not go any higher, because this is the altitude he was after, and not 1 inch above it. From here, you can still see what is happening. Somewhere down there, a marriage is being negotiated between two families who do not much care for each other. A court is sitting, and a man is losing a field to his cousin. There are markets going, and grain moving onto ships, and a woman in a village whose name was never written anywhere, standing up from a fire and putting her hands in the small of her back. There are funerals, several thousand today, as there are every day, as there were yesterday. There are armies on the move, and there is a great deal of empty country in between all of it where nothing is happening whatsoever. Here is more or less how he set it down. Anyone who wants to talk about human beings, he writes, should look at everything on the earth as though from somewhere far above, at herds and armies and farming, at marriages and separations, births and deaths, the noise of the law courts, empty places, all the various foreign nations, festivals, funerals, market days. A medley of everything, he says, and an order composed of contraries. I think that is the best sentence in the book, and I have never been able to explain to my own satisfaction why. Notice what he does and does not do from up there. He does not say humanity, he does not say the mass of mankind, or the human condition, or any of the other words we use when we want to sound as though we are looking at something, and are in fact looking at nothing. He names weddings and lawsuits and feasts and lamentations and market stalls. The particulars stay in. He has gone up exactly as high as you can go and still see that a wedding is a wedding, and he stops there. And what he is looking for is not emptiness. It is an order made out of the opposites, the funeral and the market in the same frame, not cancelling but composing. Two other pieces of the same thought sit near it. One is a line about who he is, and it is a very strange line for an emperor to write. In my official capacity, he says, my city and my country is Rome. As a human being, it is the universe. He is drawing a distinction between the identity he was given and the one he thinks is actually load-bearing, and he is putting the smaller one second. The other is his picture of how it all hangs together. Everything is woven, he writes. The connections are not incidental to the world, they are what the world is made of. One substance, one law, one reason running through everything that can reason at all. He returns to that image often enough that it starts to feel less like doctrine and more like something he could see, a single fabric in which you cannot pull at one place without the whole cloth moving somewhere else. Now, there is something badly wrong with all of this, and the fact that it is beautiful makes the problem harder to see rather than easier. Altitude does not discriminate. If it can make your grief small, it can make anything small, because it has no idea what it is looking at. From up there, the funeral and the market are the same size, and so is the difference between the man being buried and the man doing the burying. And so, this is the part that should sit badly with anyone, is the difference between the people on your side of the river and the people on the other side of it, whom you are at that moment in the business of killing. The view from above is the view from a command tent. That is not a figure of speech, it is a literal description of where he was sitting when he wrote it down. There has never been a better instrument for making it possible to give an order that would be unbearable if you were standing where it lands. Everything since, the map on the wall, the photograph taken from height, the figure at the bottom of the report, runs on exactly the same principle and works for exactly the same reason. Distance is an extremely effective anesthetic, and it does not ask what it is numbing. What can be said back is not a defense, quite, but I think it is true. He never stays up there. That is the half nobody quotes. Every single time he does this, the entry that follows is about what to do next. with this particular person in this hour, with the thing that is actually on the table in front of him. The ascent has a descent built into it. The instrument is not the height. The instrument is the round trip, which does not rescue it, because a tool with a return built in still gets picked up by people who never come back down, and there is no way to build a landing into an idea and make it hold. But it does mean the version that has reached us, the cosmic perspective as a technique for not minding things, is not the version he was running. He used it the way you would use a spirit level. Pick it up, take the reading, put it down, get on with the work. He was not trying to live at altitude. Nobody can live at altitude. There is one more thing about that passage that I find quietly funny. The lines he is remembering look very much like a page in Plato. And in Plato, the ascent is not a technique for statesmen at all. It appears in a description of the philosopher as a man hopeless at ordinary life, someone who does not know his neighbours, cannot reliably find the market, and falls down a well because he is looking at the sky. Marcus took a portrait of a man manifestly unfit to govern anything and converted it into an administrative tool. That is either a serious misreading or the most practical thing anybody has ever done with Plato, and I lean toward the second. The first thing you notice from that height, though, before the order, before the pattern, before any of the consolation arrives, is that nothing in the frame is holding still. Not one thing in it. And what he eventually made of that is the hardest thing in the whole system to swallow. So, come back down now. All the way, past the empire and the mountains, past the frontier and the frozen river, past the camp and the rows of fires and the lamp in the tent, past the century, and into this room, and into the specific arrangement of blankets and gravity that you happen to be part of at the moment. You are a warm object a few feet long, lying still in the dark, breathing without supervision and without having to think about it once. That is the entire situation. Everything else, the markets, the courts, the ships, the funerals, the several billion people awake somewhere right now who have never heard of you and never will, is carrying on perfectly well and asking nothing of you at all. It will still be carrying on in the morning. Not one bit of it is yours to hold up tonight. There is an hour you would go back to. Not a whole year, and not the enormous, obvious catastrophe, which is usually too large to be edited into anything. A specific hour with a location and a particular quality of light in which you said one thing, or failed to say one thing, or got into a car, or didn't pick up. Most people are carrying 2 or 3 of these. They tend to come out at about this time of night, unaccompanied, and they run at their original speed, and you have played them so many times that you know precisely which frame you are steering toward and precisely how it goes instead. The odd part is that you know perfectly well it is finished. Nobody replaying an hour from 4 years ago is confused about whether it can be altered. And yet the process has all the features of a negotiation, the arguing, the small revisions, the sense of a case being built, conducted with a party that is not present, about terms that were closed before most of the people currently in your life had met you. He was working on this, not on your hour, but on the general shape of the problem, and he came at it from a direction nobody would now think of, which is physics. Substance, he writes, is like a river in permanent flow. The activity in it is in continuous change, and the causes come in 1,000 varieties, and there is scarcely anything at all that stands still. Elsewhere he sharpens it. Time is a river made out of the things that happen, and a violent one, so that no sooner has a thing been seen than it has been carried past, and something else is in its place, and that will be carried past as well. And then, because when it mattered he thought in pictures, he gives it the image that stays. In a current like that, he says, where nothing holds its position, what is there that would be worth setting a high price on? You would be like a man falling in love with a sparrow going by, and by the time you had noticed the feeling, it would already be out of sight. So far, this is just the standard ancient melancholy, which anyone can produce and which has been in the repertoire since somebody first noticed that people die. What makes him different is what he does next, and it is genuinely peculiar. He decides to be on the river's side. Nothing, he writes, is so beloved of the nature of the universe as changing the things that exist and making new things like them. Somewhere else, he pictures it as a sculptor working in wax. The same material molded into a horse, then melted down and worked into a tree, then a man, then something else, each shape lasting no time whatsoever, and not one of them a waste of material. And once, only once as far as I can find, the notebook stops giving instructions and turns into something much closer to a prayer. Everything suits me, he writes. That suits you, universe. Nothing is too early or too late for me that arrives on time for you. Everything your seasons bring is fruit to me. From you, all things. In you, all things. To you, all things return. That is a man addressing the weather as a friend. Now notice exactly what is being accepted, because this is the thing that has gone missing from every modern version of the doctrine. He is not accepting the future. The future is where you act. The whole rest of the system is about acting in it, vigorously, and being responsible for how. Acceptance in his sense applies to one category only, the completed. What has already occurred cannot be otherwise, and is therefore no longer available for anything except being argued with, which is precisely the operation you were running a minute ago on that hour. The replay is not memory. Memory does not require 12 identical viewings. The replay is a negotiation conducted alone against a party with no representative in the room over terms that were settled before you had the information you now have. And the only person in the arrangement who can be harmed by it is the one conducting it. He has a much harder version too, and I am going to give it as it stands, because softening it would misrepresent the man. When a doctor prescribes something unpleasant, riding, cold baths, walking barefoot, we say that it was prescribed for him. In exactly the same way, he says, when the nature of the whole prescribes a man a disease, or a mutilation, or a loss, the word means the same thing that it means in the doctor's mouth. It has been arranged, and it has been arranged as suitable. Your illness was prescribed. Your bereavement was prescribed. That is not a figure of speech he has stumbled into. It is the doctrine laid out flat, and it is either the deepest sentence in the book or the most offensive one in it, depending almost entirely on what has happened to you in the last 2 years. There is a phrase that gets attached to all of this, and it comes from none of them. Amor fati, the love of fate. It is printed on the covers of a great many books about Stoicism and tattooed on a fair number of forearms. Marcus never wrote it. Epictetus never wrote it. No ancient Stoic wrote it. It was coined in the 1880s by the man who thought the entire tradition was a confidence trick. Friedrich Nietzsche took about a page to make the best objection anybody has ever made to this, and I think about it more often than is good for me. You want to live according to nature, he says. Consider what nature is actually like. Boundlessly extravagant, boundlessly indifferent, without purpose, without consideration, without pity, and without justice, fertile and barren in the same breath. How exactly would a person live according to that? To be alive is to be unlike it, to value things, to prefer some over others, to be partial, to want to be different from how you are. Living is a continuous act of discrimination, and nature does not discriminate about anything. And if according to nature only means according to life, then how could you possibly fail? Why make a principle out of the one thing you have no option about? Then the knife goes in. What is really happening, he says, is the exact reverse of what you claim. You say you are reading the law off the face of nature. You are writing it on. Your pride wants your morality built into the structure of the world, so you require the world to be arranged the way your school requires. And because philosophers are patient and strong-willed people, you eventually see your own face looking back, and you call the reflection a discovery. Philosophy, he concludes, simply is this tyrannical impulse, the most spiritual form of the will to power. 3 things can be said back, and not one of them is a knockout. The first is that he is describing nature as we understand it now, indifferent, purposeless, running on chance and pressure. The Stoics did not believe that, and their disbelief was not a mood. They argued for a structured, reasoning universe from the regularity of the heavens, from the fit between creatures and the conditions they live in, from the way the whole thing behaves more like a single organism than a heap of parts. Those arguments do not survive, but they were arguments put in public and defended against opponents, not a preference wearing metaphysical clothes. Nietzsche is entirely right that the conclusion was convenient. It does not follow that convenience was the only thing manufacturing it. The second is less comfortable, which is that the charge lands harder on Marcus than on almost anyone else in the school, because Marcus will not stop opening the trapdoor himself. 9 separate times in that notebook, he sets the reasoning universe alongside the possibility that there is nothing underneath but particles in motion, and 9 times he declines to choose. When the man actually practicing the doctrine will not commit to the ground it is standing on, the accusation that the ground was painted becomes considerably harder to answer. And the third is that Nietzsche's own version has the same shape as the thing he is attacking. He kept the phrase and discarded the Providence. Love your fate, say yes to it, and mean the yes. But the fate he is talking about has no plan in it and never had one, which leaves him saying yes to a blank wall and calling the yes an act of creation rather than an act of recognition. That is a real difference. And it is also, if you step back far enough, 2 men painting on the same wall, with only one of them conceding that there was nothing on it to start with. Whether the concession makes him more honest or simply lonelier is not something I can settle. I should admit that this objection has never stopped bothering me. There are stretches where I think Nietzsche plainly won, and the whole tradition has been living off the beauty of its own sentences ever since. And then something goes wrong in my own life, and I notice that what I reach for is the river and the sparrow, and not the will to power, and I have never established whether that is evidence about the argument or only evidence about me. What survives either way is smaller than the philosophy, and probably more use to you at this hour. The hour you would go back to is closed, not in a comforting way, in a plain structural way, the way a door that was welded shut in the spring of some year is closed. It has been carried past, along with everything else that has ever happened, and the current has never once run backwards for anybody's benefit. You can know that and go on arguing with it anyway. Most people do, for years, and it is not a moral failing. But the noticing is a separate act from the arguing, and it is available now, and it does not cost anything. The whole apparatus, though, the river, the wax, the seasons bringing fruit, the business of being on the universe's side, rests entirely on the universe being the kind of thing that could have a side. He knew that. He went round it for a decade and never landed, and the reason he could keep putting it off is that there was always something more immediate in front of him in that tent, and the most immediate thing, always and everywhere, was other people. Whatever you have been running tonight, the hour, the sentence you would say differently, it will be exactly the same size in the morning, not smaller. It simply will not be the only thing in the room. The dark has a way of clearing everything else off the table so that one item can have all the light, and by 9 tomorrow the table will be crowded again, which is a mercy disguised as an inconvenience. It will keep until then. It is not going anywhere, and for the next few hours, neither are you. He wrote himself a briefing for the mornings, and it does not make encouraging reading. Say this to yourself when you get up. today I am going to meet a busybody, an ungrateful man, a bully, a liar, someone envious, and someone who cannot be relied on to behave decently in company. That is the opening line, not a prayer and not a resolution, a forecast and a gloomy one, and by the sound of it, a well-tested one. Then comes the reasoning, and it takes an odd direction. All of these people are like this, he says, because they cannot tell the difference between what is genuinely good and what only looks it. But I can, and the man who does wrong is related to me, not by blood or by seed, but because he has the same intelligence in him and the same share of what is divine. So he cannot damage me, since nobody can force ugliness onto me from outside, and I cannot hate him because he is family. There is a second morning passage, and it is my favorite thing in the entire book, because in it he loses an argument with himself and then writes down the losing side. He is trying to get out of bed. In the morning he tells himself, "When you cannot face getting up, keep this ready. I am rising to do the work of a human being. Why should I be dissatisfied if I'm going out to do the things I exist to do? Or was I made for this, to lie under the blankets and keep warm?" And then another voice answers him, right there on the page. But it's nicer here. He does not cross it out. He argues with it badly, the way anybody argues at that hour. Look at the plants. Look at the ants and the spiders and the bees, all of them getting on with their own small portion of the universe. And you can feel him not quite winning. The most powerful man on earth, in his 50s, lying in the dark and negotiating with himself about the blankets. It is the least imperial paragraph ever written by a Roman emperor, and it is worth more than most of the famous ones. Now, the argument underneath both passages is stranger than it first appears, because it is not a moral argument at all. It is anatomical. "We were made for cooperation," he writes, "in the way that feet are, and hands, and eyelids, and the 2 rows of teeth. Sit with the teeth for a moment. An upper row of teeth is a completely useless object. Its entire function depends on there being another row coming up to meet it, and neither row can do anything alone. Same with the eyelids, an upper lid and a lower lid closing together, made in opposition and useless in isolation." He is not saying people ought to be nice to one another. He is saying that a human being is built the way an upper jaw is built, as one half of a mechanism, and that behaving as though you were the whole thing is not wickedness so much as a category mistake about what you are. Which is why, in his account, turning away from somebody in irritation is a kind of self-injury. It is a tooth deciding it would rather work alone. He has an entire apparatus for the practical business of not being furious with people, and it runs to 10 separate points, which tells you how often he needed it. Some of them are ordinary. Remember that they may not be doing wrong at all. Remember that you do plenty of wrong yourself. Remember that they are acting out of ignorance and that nobody chooses to be a worse person on purpose. Remember that the anger costs you more than the original offense did. 2 of them are better than that. He notes, with the fig tree in mind, that being astonished when people behave badly is exactly as sensible as being astonished when a fig tree produces figs. And then he adds a 10th point which he announces, with a small flourish, as a gift from Apollo. To expect bad men not to do wrong is madness, because it is asking for the impossible. You are permitted to want them to stop doing it to you. Wanting them to stop being what they are is a request addressed to nobody. And there is one line he wrote that I would keep if everything else went. The best way of getting your revenge, he says, is not to become like the man who wronged you. All of that is genuinely useful, and it has helped people for 2,000 years, and I want to say clearly what it is engineered for before I say what it is not. It is engineered for friction between individuals. Every example is a person in a room, the man who talks over you, the colleague who takes credit, the relative who never says thank you. It is a superb tool for the 9 o'clock meeting, and it is one of the very few philosophies that has ever taken seriously how much of a life is spent being annoyed. What it has no vocabulary for at all is machinery, the kind of harm that nobody in particular is doing, that runs on procedure, and that will keep running whether or not any individual in the chain is a good person. Which brings us to the part I would rather leave out, and that is exactly why it has to go in. Around the year 165, a philosopher was brought before the prefect of the city of Rome, along with 6 other people. His name was Justin. He had arrived at Christianity through Platonism, kept teaching after his conversion, and ran a school out of rooms above a bathhouse. What survives of the hearing reads like a hearing. The prefect asks what teachings he holds. Justin describes them. The prefect asks where the Christians meet. Justin gives an answer arranged so as not to hand over anybody else. The prefect asks whether he genuinely supposes that if he is flogged and beheaded, he will go up into heaven. Justin says he hopes so. And then the prefect issues the standard finding. Those who refuse to sacrifice are to be scourged and taken away and executed. The prefect's name was Junius Rusticus, the same Rusticus, the Stoic, the man who 2 decades earlier had reached up and taken his own copy of Epictetus down off his own shelf and put it into the hands of a young heir who would build the rest of his life on it. Marcus had appointed him to the office. Sit in that chair for a moment, because the horror of it is not where people usually look for it. You are in your 60s. You are a serious man with a serious philosophy about the kinship of all rational beings. You did not go looking for this case. Somebody else brought it to you, as somebody brings you 40 cases a week. You ask the questions the procedure obliges you to ask. The defendant declines to perform the one act that would end the matter and says so clearly several times in front of witnesses. The law on the point is not ambiguous and has not been ambiguous for 60 years. You apply it. You go home and have dinner. Nobody in that room had to be a monster. That is the whole difficulty. 12 years later, the same law produced something much worse in a Roman town in Gaul, where Lyon stands now, together with Vienne, V-E-N, downriver. We have a letter written by the survivors to the churches back east, and it was preserved intact, and it is very hard reading. It began socially rather than legally. Christians were shut out of the baths, then the markets, then the streets. Then there were beatings, then a mob, then arrests. The slaves of Christian households were tortured until they testified to what the crowd already believed: cannibalism at the meetings, incest in the dark, after which the mood turned murderous. The bishop was over 90. He was beaten so badly on the way to prison that he died there 2 days later. A deacon was burned with heated bronze plates pressed against the most sensitive parts of his body until, the letter says, he no longer had the shape of a man. And there was a slave woman named Blandinu, whose owners had expected her to give way first because she was slight and had no standing, and there was no reason at all for her to hold. Her torturers worked on her in shifts from dawn until night and admitted they had run out of things to do. On the last day she was scourged, put on a heated iron seat, wrapped in a net and thrown to a bull, and finally killed with a knife. The bodies were left in the open for 6 days. Then they were burned, and the ashes swept into the river, and the people who did it said out loud that this was so there would be nothing left to rise again. There is one more detail, and for our purposes it is the worst. Among the accused was a man who held Roman citizenship, which raised a legal question the governor did not want to decide by himself. So he wrote to the emperor for instructions. The answer came back: those who confess are to be executed, those who deny are to be released. That is the reply of the man in the tent. Now slow down, because a verdict is easier than the truth here. That answer was not a new policy. It was the existing one, and it was 60 years old, and it had been laid down by Trajan in a letter to a worried governor. Do not go looking for them. If they are accused and convicted, punish them, and if they recant, let them go. There was never a general law outlawing Christianity. There was a procedure driven by accusers and by crowds that turned a private denunciation into a capital case. Marcus restated it. He did not invent it, and he did not widen it, which is either the defense or the indictment, depending entirely on how much you think a man is answerable for a machine he inherited and left running. And the other side of the ledger is not empty. Christian writers of his own generation addressed him as someone who might listen. One bishop in Asia wrote asking him to look into what was happening in the provinces and put a stop to it, which is not how you write to a persecutor. Another submitted a formal plea to him directly. A Christian in North Africa, writing within living memory of his death, called him a protector of the Christians, and no source of any kind, hostile or friendly, describes him launching a persecution. As for his own notebook, there is exactly one line in it that appears to mention them, a remark about facing death from settled judgment rather than from sheer opposition, as the Christians do. The phrase is ungrammatical in a way that suggests a later reader wrote it in the margin and a copyist folded it into the text, which is what the best modern editors think happened. And even if it is his, the Greek word has been translated as obstinacy for centuries, when what it actually means is closer to drawing up in battle order, opposition, a stand taken, which is a considerably less contemptuous thing to say about people walking into an arena. So there is no verdict. He did not order it. He did not stop it. He signed at least one document that kept it moving, and the document said what the law had said since before he was born. But something worse than a verdict is available here, and it has nothing to do with guilt. That notebook is a record of what occupied him. 12 books of a man working seriously and repeatedly on the problem of other people, the meddler, the ingrate, the liar, the one who talks too much. He went back to it constantly. He had an entire 10-point apparatus for the man who irritates you before breakfast. And in the whole of it, there is not one line about the people being killed inside his own legal system for what they believed. No defense of it, no unease about it, no mention. The subject never comes up. That is not a Roman blind spot, and I do not think it is even a personal one. It is the failure mode of every ethics that is built entirely around what a good person does in a room. Get the room right, and you can go your whole life without once looking at the building. All of which he was writing in a tent, at a moment when his actual daily work consisted in large part of arranging the deaths of people on the other side of a river. It is worth knowing what that looked like, because there is a monument standing in Rome that shows it, and it does not flatter him. There are people asleep near you at this moment, through the wall or above the ceiling or in the next building along. People whose names you will never know and whose faces you would not recognize in daylight. Some of them, if you had to deal with them at 9 tomorrow, you would find difficult. Every single one of them is doing exactly what you are doing right now, lying still in the dark in a warm room, breathing, waiting to go under. The upper row and the lower row in the same jaw closed for the night. It is still standing in a square in the middle of Rome, with buses going round it, a stone column about 100 feet high, with a band of carving spiralling from the bottom to the top, like a bandage wound round a limb, one continuous strip several hundred feet long if you could unroll it, telling the story of a war in pictures for a population that mostly could not read. There is a saint on the top of it now. The original figure came down in the 16th century and was replaced. You can walk right up to the lower part of it, and I would suggest looking before reading, because on one of those bands, Roman soldiers are cutting the heads off bound prisoners. The prisoners are kneeling with their hands tied behind them. Their women and children are in the same frame, held, made to watch. Further along, Villages are burning with people still in them, and women are being dragged away by the hair. None of this is tucked round the back where the light is bad. It is the official account, commissioned by the Roman state, of what the philosopher emperor's army did on the Danube, carved by people with access to men who had been there, and set up in the most public square in the capital so that everybody could see how well it had gone. The war it commemorates ran on and off for about 14 years, and it started because the frontier gave way. Tribes from the north came across in force. One column of them went right through the passes and into Italy itself, burned a town in the northeast, and put the city of Aquileia, under siege, which is the sort of thing Romans had stopped believing could happen. Another raiding force got the whole way down into Greece and burned the most sacred sanctuary in the Greek world. Two of Marcus's generals cleared Italy the following year, and one of them would himself be emperor for 87 days, 2 decades later, which gives you some sense of the caliber of people this crisis produced. Then the Romans went back across the river and stayed across it for years. There is one engagement from those years that Cassius Dio describes in enough detail to see. A body of horsemen from the plains had retreated onto the frozen Danube and turned to fight there, which was a deliberate choice. They knew the ice, their horses were trained for it, and they expected the Romans to go down on the first stride. The Romans came on anyway. They dismounted, set their shields flat on the ice and put one foot on the rim for grip, and when the charge arrived, they took hold of the bridles and the shields and the shafts of the spears and simply pulled men down on top of themselves, and it turned into a wrestling match on a frozen river, in armour, with the losers going through into the water. They won. And when the peace terms were finally imposed, one of the conditions laid on that people was the return of 100,000 Roman captives. Sit with that number for a moment, because it explains what these wars were actually about at ground level. Not lines on a map. People taken across the river in raids over years and sold or kept in numbers that required a specific clause in a treaty. Now, there is one band on that column showing something else entirely, and it is the most famous image on the whole monument. A detachment of Roman soldiers has been cut off and is dying of thirst, surrounded, out of water, in a position with no way out. And above them, filling the sky, hangs an enormous bearded figure with his arms spread wide, water pouring off his beard, and his arms and his hair in solid sheets, sheltering the Romans while underneath him, the enemy and their horses drown. Something happened. Everybody agrees something happened. A Roman force in serious trouble was saved by a sudden violent storm that gave them water and broke up the people attacking them in either 172 or 174. That has never been settled either. What nobody has ever agreed on is who did it, and the 3 surviving answers are so cleanly incompatible that the whole episode works better as a demonstration of how history gets manufactured than as an event. The official Roman version is the one carved into the column. The emperor prayed and the sky answered. That is Jupiter up there with the water coming off him. Cassius Dio, writing a couple of generations afterward, says it was an Egyptian magician attached to the army, a man called Ha-Nophis, who summoned Hermes of the air. And the Christian version, which surfaces within a few decades, says the legion in question was full of Christian soldiers who went down on their knees and prayed that their God sent the storm, and that the emperor was so struck by it that he wrote a letter attesting the whole thing. That letter survives. It is a forgery, and not an especially skillful one. There is a 4th layer on top, and I like it best because you can watch the machinery working. The legion involved carried the nickname Fulminata, the Thundering. Later, Christian writers seized on that. Obviously, it was renamed for the miracle, except that the legion had been called the Thundering for well over 100 years before any of this happened, which is checkable and was eventually checked. The story arrived, found a suitable name lying about unattended, and moved in. Set that column beside the one Trajan put up 70 years earlier, a short walk away, and something has changed in the interval. Trajan's is calm and almost documentary. Soldiers building bridges, cutting timber, stacking supplies, an empire shown as a competent organization that also fights. Marcus's is cut deeper, with bigger heads and visible faces, and it is far more interested in what happens to people. Historians who work on it point out that the earlier bands still show mercy being granted, and the later ones mostly do not. The treaties had been broken, and the visual argument shifts from clemency to punishment. He did not carve it. It was finished after his death, under his son. That gets said often, and it is true, and it does not help much because he fought the wars. And there is a harder fact than the reliefs. By the middle of the 70s, he was no longer defending anything. Roman forces were operating well beyond the river, and the plan, this is reported plainly, not deduced, was annexation. 2 new provinces carved out of the country on the far bank. He was interrupted twice, and then he died, and it never happened. But the intention is on the record. A war that started because people came over, the river had turned, somewhere in the middle of it, into a war about owning the other side. What can be said for him is real, and it is not an exit. The invasion was not his doing, and the alternative to fighting was not peace. It was continued abduction on a scale that required 6 figures in a treaty. And annexation, in Roman strategic thinking, was not greed with a policy attached. It was the only known method of stopping raiding for good, on the reasoning that you cannot guard a river indefinitely and must therefore take the ground the raiders come from. It is a bad answer. It was also the only answer anybody in his profession had ever been taught. But the thing that makes this genuinely hard, and the reason I cannot get to a verdict, is what he was writing while he did it. A spider, he says, is pleased with itself when it catches a fly. One man is pleased when he catches a hare, another when he nets a fish, another when he takes wild boars, another when he takes bears, and another when he takes Sarmatians, the horsemen his own army was fighting at that moment. And then, are these not all of them robbers, if you look at what they actually believe? He wrote that during the Sarmatian War. He wrote it about himself. I know of no other sentence like it from anybody in his position in the whole of the ancient world. No other commander who put his own campaign into a list with a spider and a fly and then reached for the word robbers. Elsewhere, in the same key of exhaustion, stop hoping for Plato's Republic. Be content if one small thing moves, and do not treat that as a minor result. This is a man who has given up on transformation entirely and is performing maintenance on a machine he cannot redesign, and knows it, and goes out in the mornings anyway. So the 2 things sit side by side and will not resolve. The reliefs are accurate. Those men really were killed in that way, in his name, under his command, in a war he prosecuted and intended to enlarge. And the private record of the man commanding it contains no boasting anywhere, no triumphalism, not one victory celebrated across 12 books, and a line comparing himself to a spider. Not enjoying it changes nothing at all for the man on the column with his hands tied behind him. I want to be exact about that, because it is precisely the kind of observation that gets used as a door-out, and it is not one. Whether it changes anything about him is a different question, and my honest answer is that I do not know how much credit a person is owed for the quality of his private misgivings while he continues doing the thing. 8 winters. That is the part that will not come through in any summary, because history compresses time and the people living in it do not get to. Not one dramatic campaign, 8 of them, one after another, in the same country, in the cold, in his 50s and then his 60s, with the same river freezing and thawing and freezing, the same reports arriving, the same decisions to make about the same ground, Anyone who has been inside a long obligation knows the texture of that better than any battle account can give it. The illness in the family that has no end date, the job that cannot be left, the situation that is not a crisis anymore because it has gone on too long to be a crisis. There is no adrenaline in year 6. There is only the fact that it is still there in the morning. And so are you. And then, in the spring of 175, while he was still north of the river, a message came out of Syria to say that the emperor was dead. He read it himself. There is a moment, most nights, when the part of you that has been on watch all day quietly stands down. You never catch it going. It does not announce itself, and it does not wait for you to have finished thinking about anything. The line simply stops being patrolled, and nothing comes across it, and in the morning it turns out that nothing was ever going to. They brought him the head in a bag, which was the ordinary way of delivering that particular piece of news, and he would not look at it. He gave 2 instructions. The head was to be buried, not displayed, not carried to Rome, not set on a spike where the army could see it and draw the appropriate conclusion. Buried. And the men who had brought it, who had every reason to expect to be rich by nightfall, were sent away. It had belonged to a man he had known for 15 years and had trusted with half the world. Avidius Cassius was the best general the empire had. He came from Syria, the son of a rhetorician who had risen to govern Egypt, and he had made his name in the Eastern War, the man who took the great Parthian cities and burned the royal palace. He was a hard disciplinarian of the kind soldiers complain about and follow, and Marcus, who was 800 miles away on a frozen river and would be for years, had given him something no emperor had handed anyone before, a standing command over the entire eastern half of the empire, not a province, the East. Trust on that scale is not a compliment. It is arithmetic. The thing you do when you are 800 miles away, unwell, in your 50s, and there is no second name on the list. Anyone who has had to hand something over to the only person capable of carrying it knows the feeling precisely, and knows that it is not generosity, and that you do not sleep any better once it is done. Then, in the spring of 175, word came down from the Danube that Marcus had died. It was not an unreasonable thing to believe. He had been seriously ill, he was in his 50s, he was living in a war camp with an epidemic in it, and the distances involved meant that any news from the north arrived weeks late and second-hand. Cassius was acclaimed emperor by the legions of Syria, and Egypt came over to him almost at once. The heir in Rome was 13 years old. To a great many sensible people, the arrangement Cassius proposed, an experienced commander taking over rather than a boy, must have looked less like treason than like housekeeping. Then it emerged that Marcus was not dead. The whole thing lasted 3 months and 6 days. It ended when a centurion of his own army caught up with Cassius on a road and cut him down, and the head went north in a bag to buy a reward that never came. What Marcus did next is the part worth slowing down for. He told his own soldiers, who were spoiling for a punitive campaign, that what he actually wanted was the man alive. He wrote to the Senate, which was baying as senates do after a failed coup, and asked them not to execute anybody. He asked that no senator be put to death during his reign for this, that the families be left alone, and that the one thing he might take from the entire business was the demonstration that a civil war could be ended without a massacre following it. And when the captured papers came in, the correspondence, the letters that would have told him precisely which senators and which governors had written to Syria during the weeks when he was believed to be dead, he had them burned, unread. That last detail comes from Cassius Dio, who was a senator himself with family in the Eastern administration, so it sits closer to his own world than most of what he passes on. The clemency had edges, and leaving them out would be dishonest. Antioch had backed the revolt, and Antioch was punished public games stopped, assemblies banned, and the emperor refused for some time to enter the city at all before relenting and going. Cassius's eldest son was killed by soldiers, though not by any order of his. The remaining children were spared, kept part of the property, and were placed with relations of the imperial family. Now the case against all of this is strong, and it deserves to be put properly. Cassius was already dead when the bag arrived. Nobody had to decide anything. Forgiving a man who has been assassinated by his own officers is the cheapest transaction available in politics. You acquire the entire reputation for mercy, and you never once have to sit opposite the person and discover what you would actually do. And the reported line about being sorry he was denied the chance to be reconciled is, looked at coldly, close to perfect, a sentiment that costs nothing, can never be tested, and reads beautifully in the record. It was also, quite separately, first-rate administration. Every competent emperor understood that a purge after a failed coup destroys the very class you have to govern through and leaves the survivors permanently frightened, and frightened men conspire. Sparing them was not merely decent, it worked, which does not make it a performance. It does mean that virtue and self-interest were pointing in the same direction, and when that happens, you can never fully separate them, not in him and not in yourself, except for the letters. That is the piece that will not sit inside the cynical reading, because burning them cost him something real. An emperor who reads that correspondence knows for the rest of his life exactly which men to watch. An emperor who burns it has traded permanent, deliberate ignorance about the loyalty of his own Senate for nothing whatsoever except not having to know. That is not shrewd. That is a man declining to pick up a weapon that was lying in front of him. And somewhere in that notebook, he had already written the line that makes it hardest to be cynical about him. "Be gentle with the person who has wronged you," he says, and then adds the clause nobody ever quotes, not reproachfully and without making any display of your own forbearance. He knew that performed mercy is a variety of showing off. He wrote it down before he had any use for it. The following year, he went east, partly to steady the provinces that had gone over, and partly, one suspects, to be seen alive in them. Faustina went with him. She had been travelling with him for years by then. The army had given her a title for it, Mother of the Camp, which was not a courtesy, but an acknowledgement that she was actually there, in the winter quarters, in her 40s, on a frontier. She died on the road, in a village in the mountains of what is now southern Turkey. She was about 45. Nobody knows what it was. He renamed the village after her. He had her declared a goddess and a temple raised, and he founded a fund to support orphaned girls in her name. The village kept the name for centuries. And then the stories started. They are in the late Roman biography, the one that gave us the cheese, and they are lurid in the way that only officially sanctioned gossip gets to be. That she had slept with sailors and with gladiators, that she had poisoned people, that she had been in the revolt from the beginning, had written to Cassius herself, and killed herself when it failed, and, most memorably, that she had once seen a gladiator in a procession and been so overcome that the astrologers advised having the man killed and Faustina bathed in his blood, after which she conceived her son, which was offered as the explanation for how he turned out. Modern scholarship has gone through all of it and thrown nearly all of it away. The standard treatment calls the adultery and the poisoning what they plainly are: unfounded vilification. And once you ask who benefited from the stories, the machinery is easy to see. Her son ended badly, murdered, and formally declared an enemy of the Roman people afterward. But Marcus had to stay the good emperor. The whole later Roman idea of what a ruler ought to be was built on him. So the corruption had to have come from somewhere else, and there was a woman available, and she was dead. The one part that cannot be cleared is her role in the revolt. The best modern verdict is that the evidence is inconclusive and her involvement was probably not even necessary. Cassius had the legions and a report of a dead emperor and did not require a letter. But inconclusive is inconclusive, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. What we have from Marcus is one line, written privately, with no audience, years into the marriage, in a list of things he was grateful to the gods for. That his wife was what she was, easy to live with, deeply affectionate, and completely without pretension. That is a sentence I find much harder to disbelieve than any of the stories. And here is where the two halves of that year turn out to be the same shape. What he says was taken from him was not the pardon. Look again at the wording that comes down. What he grieves is not being able to be reconciled. A pardon is a thing one person performs. A reconciliation takes two, and it requires a conversation, and the conversation is the part that went into the ground with the head. Then, a few months later, on a road in the mountains, the second conversation was taken as well. Whatever there was to say to her about the letters, about the rumors that were already circulating, about what she had or had not done during the weeks when everybody believed he was dead, went with her. And he built a temple and renamed a village and endowed a charity for other people's daughters, which is more or less what anyone does when there is nothing left to say and a great deal of money to say it with. The philosophy has a complete answer for how to forgive somebody. It has no answer whatsoever for not being given anybody to forgive, which is, as it happens, the version most people actually get. Not the dramatic rupture, the conversation that quietly stopped being available. Somebody died or moved or simply became a person you no longer contact, and the thing that needed saying is still in you, fully drafted, revised many times with nowhere at all to be delivered. It does not decay. That is the odd part. 10 years on, it is still word perfect. There is a smaller question in here too, and it is worth putting to yourself honestly while the room is dark. If someone set a box down in front of you tonight containing the true opinions of everybody you depend on, what they said about you in the weeks when they believed you were finished, would you open it? Almost everyone says no. Almost nobody means it. There was one more thing he never got to the end of, and it had been underneath all of it the whole time, underneath the war and the plague and the burned letters and the temple in the mountains. He went round it for a decade. He set it down on the page 9 separate times, in 9 different moods, and every single time he stopped one word short of answering it. If there is a conversation you are not going to get to have, and at this hour there usually is, it does not need composing tonight. You will do it better in the morning, or you will not do it at all, and both of those are survivable, and people survive both all the time. Leave it where it is. It has waited this long without you, and it is not going anywhere before the light comes. It arrives at around 3, and it is always the same question, not the same words. It comes dressed differently on different nights, as money, or as a specific person, or as a decision you made 4 years ago and have never entirely put down. But underneath the costume, it is one question, and the question is whether any of this is going anywhere. The interesting thing is that it is not more true at 3 in the morning. Nothing about the universe has altered between 11 and now. What has altered is that the apparatus, which normally keeps the question at a workable distance, the work, the noise, the plans, the small sequence of things that need doing before Thursday, has gone off duty and left the building unattended. The question was there all day. It simply could not get a hearing. He had it too. And unlike almost everyone else who has ever written anything down, he wrote his version of it in the open, repeatedly, without resolving it, and then went on with the sentence. 9 times in that notebook, he sets the whole of his philosophy beside the possibility that there is nothing underneath it. The shortest version is 4 words in the Greek and about the same in English, either Providence or atoms. It sits at the end of the entry about withdrawing into yourself, the one people put on posters, like a trapdoor built into the floor of a very comfortable room. Now, atoms in his mouth does not mean what it means to us. It is not a term from physics. It is the name of the other side. The atomists, Epicurus and his school, and the enormous Latin poem by Lucretius, that carried the argument into Roman heads, held that everything whatsoever is made of indivisible particles moving through empty space, colliding, sticking together for a while, coming apart. There is no design in it, no intention behind it, nobody steering. The gods, if they exist at all, are elsewhere and not attending. You are a temporary arrangement of pieces that will shortly be a different arrangement of the same pieces, and there is no more purpose in your life than there is in the particular shape of a wave. Against that, his own school held that the whole thing is one rational living structure, that the order in it is genuinely there and not something we paint on, that events are strung together by a reason running through the entire fabric, and that a person is part of that reason the way a hand is part of a body. And this is not a technical footnote, because everything he practiced stands on the second picture. Accepting what happens makes sense if what happens was arranged by something that knew what it was doing. Working for the common good makes sense if there is genuinely a common thing you belong to. The entire instruction to live according to nature requires nature to be the sort of thing that can be lived according to. Take the Providence out and the floor goes. He knew that. Which is what makes the 9 passages so strange, and one of them stranger than the rest. Alexander of Macedon and his stable boy, he writes, were brought to precisely the same condition by death. Either both of them were taken back up into the same generative principles of the universe, or both of them were equally scattered into atoms. Watch what that sentence does to itself. He wants the consolation that the conqueror and the man who mucked out his horses end up level. And in the act of writing it, he notices that the leveling holds on either theory, which is true, and which is also the moment the thought stops being a comfort. Because on the second theory, they are level in the way that 2 piles of gravel are level. The fullest version of the disjunction offers 3 roads rather than 2. Either there is an unbreakable necessity running everything, or there is a providence that can be reached and appealed to, or there is a confused mass with nobody in charge at all. And then the practical consequence of each, dispatched briskly, like a man clearing a desk before bed. If it is necessity, why are you resisting? If it is providence, make yourself worth helping. And if it is a mess with no one at the wheel, then be glad that in the middle of a storm like that, you at least have a mind of your own on board. Elsewhere, he states the position flatly. Whether the universe is a heap of atoms or a system with a nature, take this as established first, that I am a part of a whole, and second, that I am closely connected to the other parts. Either way, he says, the conduct is the same. There is a reading of all this on which he is not troubled in the slightest, and it is the one most professional philosophers prefer, and it has real force behind it. On that reading, the disjunction is a move in argument rather than a wobble in conviction. The oldest move there is. Even granting your premise, my conclusion follows. He is not saying he cannot decide. He is refusing to let the practical question be held hostage to the theoretical one, because the practical answer comes out the same on both. So choose whichever cosmos you prefer and get on with the morning. And the supporting evidence is decent. He states the Stoic picture as simple fact dozens of times elsewhere without hedging. He never once argues for the other side. The disjunction always arrives in the same posture, raised, settled in a line and a half, walked past. And then there is the other reading, and I think the harder evidence sits with it, and the evidence is just the number 9. People do not return 9 times over 10 years to something they have settled. That is not how settled things behave. Nobody's private papers contain 9 separate restatements of a point they consider closed. The repetition is not the argument being made. The repetition is the tell. Whatever the sentences are doing on the page, something kept walking him back to the same doorway, and he kept looking through it, and he kept turning round. There is a third possibility that gets less attention, and I have come to think it is probably the truth, and it is a fact about the object rather than about the man. That notebook was written across roughly a decade in wildly varying conditions by someone whose circumstances during those years included an epidemic, several burials, a betrayal from a man he had trusted with half the world, and chronic difficulty sleeping. We read it as one voice because it reaches us as one object. 12 tidy books, entries lined up as if composed on consecutive afternoons. They were not. Some of those 9 passages are very probably the brisk, confident ones. Others were very probably written at the equivalent of the hour you are in now. There is no way to sort them because a page does not record what time it was. For what it is worth, the disjunction does not appear in either of the 2 books we can actually place, the ones with a location written at the top. It starts turning up from the 4th book onward. That may mean something. It may equally mean nothing, since nobody has ever established that the books stand in the order they were written. But set the man aside for a moment, because there is a harder question underneath, and it is not about his psychology. He keeps insisting it comes out the same either way. Does it? Go through the system item by item with the Providence removed and see what is still standing. The sorting of what is yours from what is not survives completely. Whether the universe is designed or accidental has no bearing at all on the fact that your judgments answer to you and the weather does not. That is a claim about minds, and it needs no cosmos behind it. The discipline of judgment survives. The gap between the event and your verdict on it is still there, still the only place you have any leverage. The view from above survives and arguably improves. It never required the pattern to be intended, it only required it to be large. What does not survive is every consolation in the book. It was prescribed for you the way a doctor prescribes. Prescribed by whom? You are a part, playing your part in the whole. There is no whole, there is an aggregate. Everything that suits you, universe, suits me, becomes a sentence addressed to nobody in an empty room. So the techniques survive the loss of the metaphysics. The comfort does not. And when he says it comes out the same either way, he is very nearly right about conduct and quite badly wrong about consolation. And I do not believe a man that careful failed to notice. A word about where that leaves me, since I have been asking you to sit in other people's uncertainty for some hours now. I do not think the universe is a reasoning organism. The atomists were in rough outline, right? And the evidence has moved steadily in their direction for 4 centuries without a serious reversal. And every time something has gone badly wrong, what I have reached for, without exception, is the equipment that only makes sense on the other theory. That is not an argument. Nobody has ever resolved it, and I have stopped expecting to. You have already answered the question, incidentally. Not in words. Whatever you would say, if pressed at 3 in the morning, about whether any of this is going anywhere, you got up this morning, you did work that will outlast the day, or looked after somebody, or kept a promise that nobody would ever have known you broke. Nothing in the atomist account requires any of that, and nothing in it forbids it either. It simply has nothing to say. You behave as though it counts, continuously, all day, for decades. And then, at this hour, you cross-examine the belief you have been acting on since breakfast and discover that you cannot produce the paperwork for it. That might be hypocrisy. It might also be the answer, arriving in the only form answers of this kind ever arrive in, not as a conclusion, but as a habit. He never closed it. What he did close in those same years, without leaving any sign anywhere that he had examined it, was the question of who came after him. and that one had a name and a face, and was at that moment about 15 years old, standing beside him on a platform in front of the northern legions while they shouted, "Your body has not been waiting for any of this to be settled. It has been running all night without a word from you, the heart doing its work unsupervised, the breathing adjusting itself to nothing in particular, the temperature held inside a single degree by machinery you have never once thought about. It will carry on doing that whether the arrangement is designed or accidental, and it has never asked. There is a whole competent operation going on underneath you that does not need the question answered and has not needed it for as long as you have been alive and does not need it tonight." The boy was 15 and the army liked him. That mattered more than anything else about him. He was tall for his age, exceptionally good with a bow and later with a spear, physically brave, generous with the men in a way his father was temperamentally incapable of being, and he had spent a good part of his childhood in the camps. So when Marcus put him up on the platform in front of the northern legions and they made the noise that armies make, it was not a formality being got through. They meant it. His name was Commodus, Com Ugdus, and by the time he was 16, he was already, formally and in law, Emperor of Rome alongside his father. The speed of it is worth laying out, because it did not happen in a moment of weakness at a deathbed. He was made Caesar at 5, along with the brother who did not live. He was given the adult toga at 13, ahead of schedule. At 15, he rode in a triumph. At 15, he was made consul, the youngest in the history of the Republic or the Empire. And a few months after that, he was made Augustus, not heir, not designate, but co-ruler, with the same standing his father had. Marcus had 4 more years to live, and he spent them ruling alongside a teenager. Go back over that list and notice what is absent from it. Any single point at which somebody could have stopped. Every step is small and defensible on its own. A title here, an honor there, the ordinary advancement of an imperial son, and at the end of the sequence, the thing is done and cannot be taken back. You will have watched a version of this somewhere. Nobody ever decides to make a situation irreversible. It simply turns out, on the far side of a run of individually reasonable steps, that it is. 1600 years later, Edward Gibbon wrote the sentence that has followed him ever since. Marcus, he said, sacrificed the happiness of millions to a fond partiality for a worthless boy, and chose a successor from his own family rather than for the state. In Gibbon's telling, the death of Marcus is the hinge on which the whole Roman world turns from gold to rust, and the man who set it turning is Marcus himself. It is a magnificent sentence. It also rests on a premise that is simply false, and the falseness of it is the most useful thing in this whole chapter. The 4 emperors before him get called, in a phrase invented long afterward, the good emperors, and the thing they are supposed to have shared is a system. Rather than hand the empire to a son, each one selected the most capable man available and adopted him. Nerva took Trajan, Trajan took Hadrian, Hadrian arranged Antoninus, Antoninus raised Marcus, merit instead of blood, 4 times running, and then, so the story goes, Marcus broke it, except that there was never any system to break. Nerva had no children, Trajan had no children, Hadrian had no children. Antoninus's sons died before he did. Not one of those 4 men ever faced the decision being held against Marcus, because not one of them had a living son to pass over. What later writers dignified as an institution was a demographic accident. 4 consecutive childless rulers, and a principle read backwards off a coincidence. Marcus was the first of them to have a grown son. The system did not survive contact with an ordinary family because it had never been a system. It had been a run of luck about which men managed to father children who lived, and the timing of the elevation is not incidental, which is the part that usually gets left out. It happened in the months immediately after Syria. He had just watched a general he trusted with half the world claim the throne on nothing but a rumour, and watched provinces go over within weeks, and learned precisely how much of the empire's stability rested on there being an obvious answer to the question of what happens when the emperor dies. At the moment that revolt began, the answer was a 13-year-old with no titles and no standing whatsoever. 18 months later, the answer was a co-emperor with full powers, acclaimed by the armies, whom no ambitious governor could plausibly ignore. That is not indulgence. That is a man bolting a door he had just watched swing open. There was an alternative, and it deserves naming because people discuss this as though there were none. His son-in-law was among the finest soldiers in the empire, a provincial by origin, married to Marcus's eldest daughter, given the hardest commands, and never once found wanting. He would be offered the throne twice in the years after Marcus's death, and both times he refused it, pleading his age and his failing eyesight. So the obvious candidate did exist. The obvious candidate had watched the job at close range for 20 years and did not want it. What Commodus became is not really in dispute, whatever you make of the hostile sources. Cassius Dio was in the chamber for one of the more famous afternoons and set down what he saw. The emperor, in the arena, cut the head off an ostrich. He then walked over to where the senators were sitting, holding the bird's head in one hand and the bloodied sword in the other, and stood there in front of them, saying nothing at all, grinning, and moved the head a little, so that everyone present understood exactly what was being proposed. Dio says the senators had to chew the laurel leaves out of their own wreaths to keep from laughing, because laughing would have finished them. He fought in the arena hundreds of times and billed the treasury an enormous fee for each appearance. He had himself represented as Hercules in the lion skin with the club. He renamed the months of the year after his own titles, renamed the legions and the fleet after himself, renamed the Senate, and renamed the city of Rome. He handed the actual work of government to a series of favourites, one of whom sold public offices at such a rate that in a single year there were 25 consuls. He was strangled in his bath at 31 by the man he wrestled with, after a poisoning failed, and the Senate declared him a public enemy and sent people out across the empire to chisel his name off the stone. Now, how much of that was visible in a 15-year-old standing on a platform? Almost none of it, honestly. The worst of that reign belongs to the middle 80s and after, following several years alone at the top and an assassination attempt organised by his own sister. The boy his father elevated was athletic, popular with soldiers, not obviously a fool, and had spent his entire childhood being prepared for the position by the most conscientious man in the empire. Gibbon calls him a worthless boy from a desk in 1776 with the complete record spread out in front of him. Marcus was looking at a teenager in a war camp with 3 or 4 years left. But something in the charge survives all of that, and it is not political. The method he gave his life to is a method for seeing clearly. Underneath all the vocabulary, that is the entirety of it. Take the thing in front of you, strip off what you have added to it, describe what is actually there. He ran that on his dinner and on the robe he was wearing. He ran it on fame, on his own body, on death, on the people who annoyed him, and, most impressively, on his own motives at the moments when he was behaving well. And there is exactly one object in his life that he never once turned it on. 12 books, hundreds of entries across a decade, not one line about his son, no praise, no anxiety, no note about what should be done, no attempt to describe him plainly. The most relentlessly examined life to survive from the ancient world has a hole in it in the shape of a boy. I do not think that is cowardice, and I do not think it is an oversight. I think it is a limit the philosophy has and never admits to having. The instrument does not work on your own child. It cannot be made to work. Whatever apparatus you have assembled for seeing things as they are switches itself off at that particular doorway in everyone without exception, and the switching off is not a flaw in your character. It is very nearly the definition of the relationship, which means that what is being demanded of him here is impossible in a way that has nothing to do with him being weak. A philosophy of clear sight and the condition of being somebody's father do not both fit inside one person. You are given one of them. There is a colder possibility, though, and it would be dishonest to leave it out. He may have seen perfectly well and proceeded anyway. He had done the arithmetic on civil war more than once, and he may simply have concluded that a mediocre emperor costs less than an armed dispute over the succession, that a bad reign is survivable, and a war between legions might not be. On that reading, there is no blindness in it at all. It is a deliberate purchase, made by a man who knew what he was buying, at a price he judged fair, and who turned out to be wrong by an extraordinary margin. From this distance, those two readings are indistinguishable. They produce exactly the same silence in the notebook. I have no way of telling which one I am looking at, and neither does anybody else. You know the person, incidentally. Almost everyone does, and it is nearly always the same category: a child, or a sibling, or a parent, or somebody you have loved for a very long time. Other people have told you about them. More than one person, probably, at separate times, from different directions, and with no reason to coordinate. And you listened, and you nodded, and you did not accept a syllable of it, and you were not being dishonest when you nodded. The apparatus you use on everybody else does not run on that person. It is not that you refuse to use it. It is that when you point it at them, the readings come back wrong every single time, and you know they are wrong, and you cannot get different ones. The empire recovered eventually, in the way empires do, which is badly and after a great deal of blood. What happened to the man is stranger. Within a couple of centuries, he had stopped being a person and started being a standard, something people measured rulers against rather than someone anybody remembered, and the rewriting has never once stopped since. By the time he reached us, the man had been quietly rewritten by people who were not attempting to deceive anybody at all. You cannot see anything in this room at the moment. Not really. Shapes at best, and most of that is memory rather than sight, the furniture assembled out of where you know it is, rather than out of anything reaching your eyes. And for once, that costs you nothing whatsoever. Nothing in here needs assessing. Nothing in here is waiting for your verdict on it. There is no one in this room you have to be right about. In 1696, an English clergyman climbed onto a scaffold beside two men who had plotted to murder the king and gave them absolution in front of the crowd. He was outlawed for it and never submitted. He spent the rest of his life outside the establishment, and 2 years later published a furious book attacking the English theatre for corrupting the morals of the nation, which was so effective that it changed what could be staged for a generation. His name was Jeremy Collier, and in 1701 he brought out an English version of a Roman emperor's private notebook under the title The Emperor Marcus Antoninus, his conversation with himself, which is, incidentally, a considerably better title than the one it goes by now. Somewhere in the third book, he came to a short entry. Rendered closely, it runs, "Revere your faculty of judgment. Everything rests on this, on your ruling part not holding any opinion that is out of step with nature and with what it is to be a reasoning creature." Collier turned that into the following. "The happiness of your life depends upon the quality of your thoughts. Therefore, guard accordingly, and take care that you entertain no notions unsuitable to virtue and reasonable nature." You have met the first 11 words of that. Everyone has. Watch what happened in the crossing. The Greek is an instruction about a faculty, about the thing in you that forms judgments, which for a Stoic is the whole of what you actually are and the only property you hold outright. Revere it. Treat it as sacred. It is a command about a capacity. The English is a claim about happiness. It says that how well your life goes is a function of the quality of what passes through your head, which is a different proposition and a much more comfortable one. And it is more or less the founding sentence of 3 centuries of self-improvement writing. Then time did the rest, because the second half fell off somewhere along the way. What circulates now is 11 words with no therefore, no virtue, and no reasonable nature, just the bare claim in a serif font over a photograph of a mountain. He was not a forger, and I do not want him painted as one. Translation in his period was a different trade. The job was to carry the sense over into living English, not to supply a crib for people checking against the Greek, and Collier would have been genuinely bewildered by the accusation. His version is a reading rather than an invention. If the only thing you own is your judgment-forming faculty, and your condition depends entirely on its state, then the happiness of your life depends upon the quality of your thoughts is a defensible gloss. It is simply not what the man wrote, and it is the most quoted sentence ever attributed to him. The second alteration comes 300 years later, is far subtler, and I have more sympathy for it, because the sentence it produced is genuinely beautiful. In 2002, Gregory Hayes published a translation that did more than any other single book to put the notebook back into general circulation. It is quick and plain and modern. It reads like a man talking rather than like a monument, and it deserves the reputation it has. There is a passage in the 5th book about other people getting in the way, and a line in it that runs in a literal rendering: a hindrance to a given duty becomes a help, and an obstacle in a given path becomes a furtherance. Hayes gives it as the impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. Nothing has been falsified. The antithesis is there in the Greek, and the sense is preserved. What has changed is the force. In Marcus, it is one observation sitting inside a longer thought about how to deal with people who obstruct you. In English, it has become a freestanding maxim with the cadence of a law of physics, the sort of sentence that does not invite you to examine it so much as to agree with it and feel improved. 2 alterations, 3 centuries apart, both made by serious men doing honest work, neither of them attempting to deceive anybody. That is the entire point. Nobody has to lie for this to happen. Meanwhile, the man himself was being assembled and reassembled by whoever had a use for him. In 1859, John Stuart Mill reached for him in the argument for freedom of thought and used him as a warning. Here, Mill said, was very nearly the best man who ever held power, the gentlest ruler on record, holding himself to obligations stricter than anyone imposed on him, and possessed of every quality you would want in someone deciding what may be said, and he persecuted. Which proves, Mill argued, that sincerity and goodness are no protection whatsoever against doing something monstrous with authority over opinion, and that this is exactly why nobody can be trusted with it. 4 years later, Matthew Arnold wrote an essay in reply to that passage and called him perhaps the most beautiful figure in history. 4 years, the same man. In one hand, the proof that good people do terrible things, in the other, the most beautiful figure in history. Neither writer was being dishonest. They needed different things, and he was available, and the version circulating now needs something different again. Discipline, hardness, cold water, no complaining, control. There is a word for it, coined recently by a philosopher who works on this material and has watched it happen. Stoicism. It comes with merchandise. Rings, coins, planners, medallions with "Remember you will die" stamped on them, sold to people who will not. I want to make the case for the poster before I make the case against it, because the case for it is stronger than people who read Greek generally admit. A sentence that gets somebody out of bed on a bad morning has done work. Real work, of the kind philosophy is supposed to do and mostly does not, because most of it is written for other philosophers. If a mangled 11-word version of a line about the ruling faculty is at this moment keeping somebody sober or getting them through a diagnosis, then the mangling has produced more good in 20 years than the accurate version managed across the previous 18 centuries, during which almost nobody read it at all. And he would not have minded. He quoted Epicurus, the opposing school, the people who thought his entire cosmos was a fantasy, with no embarrassment whatsoever, because what interested him was whether a thing was true and usable, not whose colours it wore. Somebody who takes a sentence, improves its English and hands it to a stranger who needs it is doing exactly what he did. There is a harder point underneath that too. Every text that survives by being useful to people who misunderstand it. That is the mechanism, not an unfortunate side effect of it. Nothing gets copied by hand for 1,000 years out of scholarly scruple. It gets copied because somebody wanted it badly enough to spend the winter on it. The alternative to being misread is not being read properly. The alternative is being lost. Here is what it costs, though, and the cost is specific rather than snobbish. The man being sold does not feel anything, and that man never existed. The document those slogans are quarried out of is the record of somebody losing his composure and going back for it again and again for a decade. A man who had to write down that he ought not to be afraid of losing his son because he was afraid, who lost an argument with himself about getting out of bed and wrote down the losing side, who needed to remind himself 9 separate times that the answer held either way, which is not what you do with a settled matter. So the poster version has a failure mechanism built into it. If you believe that this philosophy means not being troubled, then the first morning you are troubled, you will conclude you have failed at it, and shortly afterwards you will stop. The accurate version has no such flaw, because the accurate version is a description of a man being troubled and carrying on regardless. It is far less impressive. It is also the only one that works. But there is a deeper reason he could not survive any of this, and no translator is answerable for it. You cannot quote a repetition. The single most important fact about that notebook is that he says the same things again, not once, beautifully, repeatedly, in slightly different words, across 10 years, in a tent. That is the whole of the evidence that this was a practice rather than a doctrine, and it is the only evidence anybody has about what the philosophy was actually like to live inside. And it is exactly the feature that cannot be extracted. Take one sentence out and set it on a wall, and you have necessarily removed the only proof that he needed to say it more than once. The quotation is not a neutral container. It converts a man struggling into a man announcing, and it cannot do anything else, however faithful the words are. Which means the damage was not done in 1701 or in 2002. It was done the first time anybody copied out a single line. You have met him, by the way, whether or not you registered it, on a wall in a gym, or at the bottom of somebody's email, or in a caption under a photograph of the sea. And you are now in the mildly irritating position of knowing that 2 of the most famous things he said were said by an outlawed English clergyman and a classicist from Virginia. So you have a choice, and it is smaller than it looks. You can have the accurate version or the useful one. Most people take the useful one and then quietly enjoy knowing that it is not accurate, which is an extremely cheap pleasure, and I'm not going to pretend I'm above it, because I'm not. All of which puts us back where we started, with the only question that has been genuinely open the whole way through. He wrote the same handful of things down over and over for 10 years, and we still do not know whether that means they never worked. There is one night left to look at. It is the one where he stops. Something happens to sentences at about this depth, and you may have noticed it already tonight. The words keep arriving, but they stop assembling. You read a line 4 times and it means slightly less on each pass, until it is not a line anymore, just a shape with a rhythm attached to it. And then not even that. That is the mechanism doing exactly what it is supposed to do. Nothing here needs retaining. Nothing you have heard tonight is going to be quoted back at you in the morning by anybody, including you. On the last day, he sent his son out of the room. The reason given is that he did not want the boy catching whatever he had, which is almost certainly true, and is also, considering everything, one of the sadder sentences in the record. 18 years old, about to inherit the world, sent outside for his own safety by a father with a few hours left and no possible way to use them. To the people who stayed, he said something they remembered well enough to write down. Do not weep for me. Think about the plague instead, and about death in general, which belongs to everybody. That is either the coldest thing a dying man ever said to his friends, or the warmest, and I have moved between those 2 readings for years without settling. What he is doing is pushing their grief off himself and onto the thing that was actually killing people by the 1,000 outside the walls. He is declining to be the largest object in the room on the single occasion in his life when he had an unarguable right to be. And then the Tribune of the Watch came in for the password. This was ordinary business. Every evening in every Roman camp, the officer of the night watch goes to the commander for the word that will be used on the perimeter, so that in the dark, a friend can be told from a stranger. It had to be given before the night started. It could not wait for anything, including this. Stand in the doorway for a moment if you like, because somebody did. You have come in for a routine item, the same item you collect every evening, and the man you are collecting it from is visibly not going to be here tomorrow, and you are not going to mention that, and neither is he. He gave it. Go to the rising sun, he said. I am setting. That is the last thing he is recorded as saying. And the man who wrote it down was a Roman senator with no reason whatsoever to prettify it. Notice what it actually is. Not an epigram, not a philosophical position. It is an instruction to a soldier with a password inside it, delivered on schedule by a man who was dying and did not intend to hold up the watch on his account. After that, he covered his head as though he meant to sleep and died in the night. 19 years earlier, another emperor had given a watchword and turned over in exactly that way, and the man who took the empire off him was there when it happened. Whether that was anywhere in his mind at the end, nobody can say. It is a strange thing to inherit. It is stranger to repeat. Where this took place is not settled, and probably never will be. One source, writing about 180 years afterward, puts it at the fortress on the Danube where Vienna now stands. Another, writing within 17 years of the event and generally taken more seriously on this particular point, puts it several hundred miles to the east at a city on the Sava in what is now Serbia. The argument is still live. A paper reopened it a few years ago on archaeological grounds. I could choose one. It would round the sentence off nicely. But he has been tidied up quite enough already by people who wanted a cleaner line, and the honest position is that we do not know which room he was in. The senator who preserved the watchword also gave a verdict, and it is worth having precisely because it is not adulation. He did not have the luck he deserved, he wrote. He was never strong in body, and he was in difficulty for practically the entire reign. And then, which is exactly why I admire him more, because in the middle of extraordinary trouble, he preserved both himself and the empire. Both. The doubling is the point. Whatever he did it twice over, inward and outward, at the same time, for 19 years. The book he left had no title, because he had never made a book. It was a pile of entries composed for one reader who was already present. The Greek heading that comes down through the manuscripts is only a description of what the thing is, to himself. The name it travels under now was supplied in 1634 by an English translator who needed something to put on a cover. There is one more object, and it is the reason you know what his face looked like. On the Capitoline Hill in Rome, there is a bronze of a man on a horse, larger than life, one arm out in a gesture of address, the horse caught mid-stride. It is the only equestrian bronze that survives from the ancient world. There were more than 20 of them in Rome alone. Every other one went into a furnace, because a large bronze statue, considered practically, is a very large quantity of bronze. His survived by mistake. All through the Middle Ages, everyone in Rome was confident the rider was Constantine, the first Christian emperor, the one who made the church legal, and you did not melt down Constantine. So it stood, protected, for something close to 1,000 years, entirely on the strength of being somebody else. By the time the error was cleared up, it had been standing so long that nobody was willing to lose it, and in 1538 it was carried up the hill to be the centerpiece of a new square laid out by Michelangelo. The writing had a comparable run. The complete Greek text comes down to us in essentially one manuscript, copied about 1,200 years after his death and now in the Vatican. The other pillar, under every modern edition, is a single printed book from the 1500s, made from a manuscript that disappeared within a decade of being used and has not been seen since. The obvious thing to say is that this is ironic, that the man who insisted posterity was worthless got a spectacular one by luck. And that is fun to say, and I have said it, and it is wrong. Look at it once more. He claimed that being remembered afterward is worth nothing, and he said it repeatedly, in a dozen different formulations, sometimes with real bitterness. And what actually happened is exactly that. Nothing in his survival was earned. Nobody preserved him because he deserved preserving. A bishop had a worn-out copy and paid a scribe. Some medieval Romans got a name wrong. A pope wanted an impressive square and had access to a very good architect. Not one of those decisions had the smallest connection to the quality of the man. So the accidents are not a joke at his expense. They are the demonstration. He said posterity is arbitrary and worthless as a measure of anything, and then his own posterity turned out to be arbitrary, and its uselessness as a measure is precisely what the story proves. He was right, and being right cost him nothing at all, because he had already stopped wanting the thing. Which leaves the question that has been open since the first minute. Did it work? I owe you an answer rather than an elegant swerve, so here is the most honest one I have. I do not know, and I have come to think the question is put together wrong. Consider what the evidence would look like if it had worked. A man who no longer needed to write it down, somebody who reached the settled condition the doctrine describes, and having reached it, put the notebook away, because you do not keep reminding yourself of something you securely have. There is no such document. Not from him, and not from anybody else, in any tradition, in any century. The literature of every practice on earth is written by people who are still practicing. Now consider what it would look like if it had failed. Someone who stopped, who tried it for a few years in his 30s, found it did not deliver, and moved on to something with a better return. He did not stop. He was still at it at 58. In a camp, sick, having buried a wife and most of his children, and the colleague he had made his equal, and the general he had trusted with half the world, with a son he could not see clearly, and a frontier that would not hold. That is not how a man behaves about something he has concluded is useless. It is also not how a man behaves about something he considers finished. And the shape of the last 2 years is worth having, because it may be the strongest single piece of evidence in the file. He had come back to Rome in the winter of 176 after the Eastern journey, after leaving his wife in a village in the mountains. He was 55. He had been at war or on the road for most of 15 years. He was chronically unwell, and there was not a living Roman who would have thought the worse of him for staying in the city and letting other men hold the river. Emperors did precisely that. It was the ordinary arrangement, and he had commanders who were better at the work than he was. In the August of 178, he went north again. He took his son with him. He spent what was left of his life in the same country, on the same frontier, at the same unfinished job, and he died there with the war still running, and within months of the funeral, the boy had made peace on terms the army considered disgraceful and gone home to a triumph. There is a report from the usual unreliable quarter that at the very end he stopped taking food and water, not from any inability to swallow. Deliberately, because he could see what was arriving and did not intend to make a production out of meeting it, which leaves the only conclusion the evidence actually supports, and it is smaller and better than either of the ones people want. It was never a cure, it was a practice. Practices do not have an end state, and asking whether one worked makes no sense without naming a date. And on any given date, the honest answer is today, yes, or today, no. And the only thing that carries across the dates is whether you went back. Which brings it to you, since you are the one still awake. You have a handful of things you have to tell yourself. Not many. Most people run to 3 or 4, and they are usually embarrassingly plain when you write them down. That this will pass. That you are not the worst thing you have done. That the person is gone, and no amount of going over it brings them back into the room. That you are allowed to want something. That the fear is not information. You have been telling yourself these for years, some of them for decades, and they do not stay told, and that is the part that makes people feel like frauds. You get the sentence into position, and it holds for a week or for a night, and then it slides, and you have to put it back, and putting it back feels like evidence that you never really learned it. It is not evidence of that. It is what having it consists of. Nobody arrives at a condition where the sentence stays put by itself. The people who look as though they have are either not telling you the truth or have quietly stopped trying. The most powerful man who has ever lived wrote his down by lamplight in a tent for 10 years in his own hand and never once got to stop either. So put it down now. Whichever of your few sentences came into the room with you tonight, it does not need saying again before morning. It has been said enough times to be load-bearing. It will be there when you want it, and if you do not want it tomorrow, that is also allowed. Your breathing slowed a while ago. You did not arrange that. It happened while you were listening to something else, which is generally how it happens. There is nothing you need to do about it, and nothing that was open tonight is in any danger from you. Whether any of it means anything, whether he was a good man, whether the medicine ever worked, all of that has been open for 1800 years and will still be open at breakfast. It does not need you awake to keep it going. It has managed this long without either of us. He covered his head and let the night have him, and the last thing he did before that was hand a single word to the man walking out to stand the watch. Do the small remaining thing properly, and then let somebody else hold the line for the hours you are not there. Somebody is holding it, not you, not tonight. Rest now. Good night.